There was once an island where evolution seems to have taken a different turn. In a cave beneath the hills of Flores, scientists uncovered the bones of a human, unlike any they expected to find smaller stranger, and isolated for so long that it challenges the way we think about our own past. This was not a myth, not a legend, but a real branch of humanity hidden on a forgotten island. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy ancient mysteries, lost worlds, and the strangest stories from human history. Now let's step into the island where humans evolved differently. Night gathers early around the limestone mouth of Liangboa Cave, and the air inside carries the cool breath of stone ash and old water. Bats slip through the dark overhead. The floor looks unremarkable at first glance, just layered earth and rock beneath a cathedral of mineral walls, the kind of place where time settles instead of passing. Yet under that floor lies a version of humanity that does not fit the story most people think they know. Not the large-brained march toward modernity. Not the clean progression from primitive to advanced. Something smaller is here, stranger. A human presence reduced in scale but not erased in ability, cut off on an island and shaped until it becomes something so unexpected that when its bones finally emerge into the light, the discovery sounds almost like an error. An adult body scarcely taller than a child, feet out of proportion, wrists and shoulders carrying hints of deeper antiquity, a brain no bigger than anyone would comfortably expect from a creature using tools and surviving in a hard landscape. The cave keeps that secret for thousands of years, while above it generations come and go, forests thicken and burn, rain falls, volcanoes brood in the distance, and the island of Flores waits in the chain of Indonesia like a sealed room in the house of the human past. The strangeness begins with the setting. Flores is not an island that announces itself as impossible. It rises green and rugged from warm seas marked by mountains, valleys, mangroves, sharp ridges and long stretches of coast where the water shines with deceptive calm. It is beautiful in the way many islands are beautiful, lush from a distance and punishing at close range. The slopes can be steep, the interior broken, the seasons unreliable. The sea around it is not merely a border but a filter. Deep channels separate Flores from neighbouring lands, and those waters matter more than the coastline ever could. They mean this island has long stood apart, not fully joined to the great continental shelves, even when sea levels dropped during the ice ages. Animals arrive only rarely. Humans arrive, if they do at all, by crossing barriers that should have stopped them. Anything that survives here must survive with limits. Fewer predators in some periods, fewer competitors in others, fewer resources almost always. Islands do this to life. They shrink it, distort it, isolate it, simplify some pressures and intensify others. Over long enough spans, they can produce forms that look like revisions of familiar creatures, as if evolution has taken an old design and redrafted it under constraint. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because Flores does not simply preserve one mystery. It preserves an entire mood of human prehistory that feels almost wrong by modern expectations. The usual map of the past tells of Africa as origin, Eurasia, as expansion, and islands as late destinations reached by capable modern people with boats, planning and numerical advantage. Flores unsettles that comfortable picture. Here, on a relatively small island cut off by water, there survives evidence that some ancient humans not only made the crossing long before such journeys should have been easy, but remained isolated long enough to become physically distinct in remarkable ways. Not myths, not a sailor's tale. Bones, teeth, stone tools, layers of sediment, burned traces, animal remains. What survives in the record suggests that this was not a passing visit nor a single accident of drift, but a sustained human presence adapted to an island world that narrowed the possibilities of life and reshaped the body accordingly. That is what gives the place its unsettling power. Flores hints that human evolution is less like a straight road than an archipelago of experiments, some large, some small, some long-lived, some abruptly terminated. On one branch of that scattered history in a cave on this island lived beings close enough to be called human, and different enough to disturb the boundary of the word. Their later scientific name, Homo floresiensis, is tidy and formal, but the fossils themselves resist tidy feeling. The first reaction they provoke is scale. Everything seems reduced. The skull, the limbs, the stature. Then the second reaction follows close behind, if reduced then from what? From a population of larger-bodied ancestors stranded and altered over immense time, from some even older lineage carrying traits that survived in isolation after disappearing elsewhere. Scholars still debate parts of that question, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the challenge is clear from the beginning. Flores introduces a human story that seems to move in a different direction from the one many assume evolution must take. It would already be a compelling island if its only surprise were human. But Flores is crowded with clues that the whole ecosystem has long behaved according to strange rules. In the prehistoric record there are dwarf proboscideans, elephant relatives diminished by island life into smaller forms. There are giant rats outsized by the standards of the mainland. There are the enduring predators and scavengers of this region, including Komodo dragons on nearby islands, and in past periods, formidable reptilian dangers within the broader environment. The pattern is familiar to biologists, and still astonishing to everyone else on islands. Large animals often become small, small animals can become large, and the ordinary proportions of the world start to drift. This is sometimes called island evolution, but the phrase is almost too clean. It sounds orderly. In reality, it is an accumulation of trade-offs: less food, fewer threats, smaller breeding populations, repeated bottlenecks, long isolation, harsh local conditions. Over time, bodies become negotiations with place. And that raises the deeper fascination of Flores. If elephants can become dwarfed, if rodents can grow enormous, what happens to humans on an island that is difficult to reach, difficult to leave, and limited in what it can provide? For much of modern history, that question would have sounded nearly absurd. Humans adapt through culture tools and flexibility. They do not, people assumed, get trapped long enough for island pressures to remake them so dramatically. Or if they do, the changes should still remain within a range we find familiar. Flores interrupts that assumption with quiet force. The cave does not shout. The bones are small. The conclusions emerge reluctantly argued over, resisted, refined. Yet the effect is larger than the fossils themselves. Suddenly the human family is not just branching and migrating. It is narrowing in one place, persisting in another, carrying archaic features here and surprising capacities there. The image becomes harder to simplify. There is also something haunting in the timing. These island humans are not buried so deep in time that they belong to some unreachable dawn of prehistory. Their existence overlaps with periods that edge closer to the world of modern humans. That alone creates a strange double vision. Somewhere on Earth, people anatomically like us are spreading, innovating, painting, crossing landscapes, building social worlds of increasing complexity. And on Flores, in a cave beneath volcanic hills, there may still be a small-bodied human lineage shaped by isolation and scarcity, surviving with tools and fire in a world tuned to very different proportions. The human past seen this way is not a parade with one figure replacing the next. It is a crowded twilight landscape where different kinds of humans endure at once, some meeting, some never meeting, some disappearing with barely a trace beyond a few bones and stone flakes. Liangbua becomes the place where that twilight hardens into evidence. The cave itself sits inland, broad, and sheltering a chamber with enough depth to preserve long sequences of occupation. Sediments build gradually, ash falls from eruptions, bones are dropped, buried, disturbed, preserved again. Over thousands of years the ground becomes an archive written in fragments. When archaeologists work through these layers, they are not simply digging for objects. They are moving through pulses of climate changes in fauna shifts in human activity, and interruptions from the restless geology of the region. The cave offers no complete narrative at once. It offers pieces. A skull here, a jaw there, limb bones with proportions that prompt second looks and then long arguments, stone tools in association, faunal remains nearby, dating evidence that places this population within a late and deeply provocative chapter of prehistory. No single find explains the whole picture. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature. But together the remains insist on reality. Even now, what makes Flores feel so powerful is not only that it produced a scientific surprise, but that it exposes the fragility of confidence. For generations, people built a human story around progress in size, complexity, and apparent superiority. Larger brains, larger worlds, broader control. Flores offers a counterimage, a population apparently becoming smaller, living within narrow ecological limits, surviving not because it dominates everything around it, but because it is fitted to an island that asks different things. The lesson is not that evolution reverses in some simple sense. It is that evolution never cared about modern pride. It responds to conditions, it pairs away, it improvises, it leaves beings exquisitely suited to one place and vulnerable everywhere else. That is why the island feels almost allegorical without ever ceasing to be real. It stands as a reminder that humanity has never been singular for long, never as uniform, never as inevitable as later memory prefers. There were other ways to be human, other scales, other bodies, other constraints. Some endured in valleys, on coasts, in forests, in caves. Some vanished before they could leave more than a handful of traces. Some may have lasted so late that our own species moved through neighbouring seas while they still hunted, gathered, watched fires, and listened to the same wind working through leaves and stone. So the mystery begins not with a name or a theory, but with a place. An island separated by water that ancient animals rarely crossed and ancient humans somehow did. A cave in which time compacted layer over layer until one buried population waited for discovery. A landscape of volcanoes, monsoon shifts, dangerous coastlines, and ecological limits strong enough to reshape life itself. Flores appears at first as a remote point on a map. Then the evidence accumulates, and the island changes scale in the mind. It becomes larger than its size, a pressure chamber of evolution, a warning against simple narratives, a pocket of prehistory where the human story bends. And once that bend becomes visible, it is impossible to look at our species in quite the same way again. Flores exists because the earth in this part of the world does not sit still. It shudders, lifts, breaks, melts, and rebuilds itself with patient violence. To understand why this island could produce such an unusual human story, it helps to begin far below the forests and villages, beneath the volcanic ridges and dry seasonal grasslands in the unstable architecture of Southeast Asia. Here, tectonic plates meet in a long zone of subduction and fracture, where oceanic crust is forced downward and heat rises back toward the surface in chains of volcanoes. islands appear not as fragments broken off from a continent, but as products of collision, uplift, eruption, and sediment laid down over immense spans of time. Flores is one of those islands. It is mountainous because it is born from pressure. It is volcanic because the deep earth below it is active. Its soils can be rich, but its stability is always conditional. In the distance, cones and ridgelines mark old eruptions and future ones alike. The landscape is beautiful in a way that depends on disruption. That geological restlessness matters because it creates the island physically, but it does not explain the deeper strangeness by itself. The true power of Flores lies in its separation. During the ice ages, when huge quantities of the world's water were locked in glaciers and sea levels fell, many islands in western Indonesia were connected to mainland Asia by broad exposed plains. What is now ocean became land bridge, and animals could move across those routes with relative ease. But Flores was different. It lay beyond deep water channels that remained barriers even when the seas were far lower than today. It belonged to a region where continental logic no longer worked cleanly, where some islands were never simply extensions of Asia and never easily reached by terrestrial migration alone. This is one of the defining facts of the island, and one of the reasons it matters so much. Flores was not merely off to the side, it was genuinely isolated. That isolation belongs to a broader biogeographic puzzle that naturalists have long recognized in this part of the world. West of a notional boundary, Asian animals dominate. East of it, species begin to look more Australasian. Between those zones lies a transitional world of islands where the distribution of our animals becomes patchy, surprising and deeply revealing. Flores sits within that transition. It is close enough to other islands to tempt the eye into imagining easy movement, yet separated by channels deep enough to defeat that illusion. The distances are not enormous by modern standards. On a map they can seem almost trivial. But for a land animal without seafaring ability, or for early humans without advanced watercraft, even a relatively narrow stretch of sea might as well be a wall. That is one of the island's great themes, the difference between apparent nearness and actual reachability. Over hundreds of thousands and indeed millions of years, that difference transforms Flores into an evolutionary filter. Not everything can get there. Not everything that gets there can thrive. Those that do arrive enter an enclosed world of finite resources, changing climates, steep terrain, and recurring geological disturbance. Populations on islands are often small. Small populations are vulnerable to accident, drought, disease, storms, and volcanic events. They also drift genetically in ways continental populations often do not, especially when fresh arrivals are rare or absent. Natural selection still operates, but so do chance, bottleneck, and isolation. Traits that would vanish in larger populations may persist. Traits that are mildly useful under constraint may become central. Body size, metabolism, developmental timing, reproductive strategy, even behavior can shift over long spans in directions that make sense only within the limits of place. Flora seems almost designed to magnify those effects. The island is rugged, which means it contains multiple microenvironments rather than one uniform habitat. Rainfall varies. Some slopes are greener, some more seasonal, some more exposed. Water availability changes over time. Forests can dominate in one period, more open country in another. Volcanic activity periodically resets the ecological balance. The coast offers marine resources, but the interior imposes distance and effort. Large rivers are not arranged to make easy corridors across the entire island. Instead, there are ridges, basins, caves, pockets of shelter, and zones where animals and humans would have moved carefully, not freely. It is the kind of terrain that can hold a population in place while also dividing it internally. That combination of confinement and fragmentation is important. Isolation does not just happen between islands. On a place like Flores, it can happen within them. Sea level changes complicate the picture further. During glacial periods, lower seas make some crossings shorter and expose more coastal plain, altering local ecologies, and perhaps making certain routes more conceivable. But lower sea levels do not eliminate the essential problem. The deep water barriers remain. Flores stays an island in the meaningful sense. This is why the question of arrival is so significant. Any early hominin that reached Flores did something improbable, whether by intentional crossing, accidental rafting after storms or tsunamis, or repeated trial and error over long periods. Some ancestor made it past a maritime boundary that should have sharply reduced the chances of settlement. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how those crossings occurred, and scholars still debate whether the earliest arrivals were deliberately seafaring or beneficiaries of extraordinary chance. But however it happened, the result is what matters most for the island's later history. Once a small founding population is established, the water does the rest. It prevents easy replenishment. It keeps the gene pool narrow. It turns survival into a long experiment. This is one reason islands often produce what look like exaggerations of nature's quieter tendencies. On a continent, competition is broad and constant. Predators are more varied. Prey is more abundant but also more heavily contested. Gene flow can wash through populations across wide ranges. On an island, the field contracts. There may be fewer predators, fewer competitors, and fewer food options all at once. That sounds simpler, but it often produces more dramatic outcomes. Large-bodied animals that require extensive resources are under pressure to become smaller. Small-bodied animals that face fewer predators may expand into niches that allow larger size. Some species lose defenses they no longer need. Others become highly specialized. Some simply vanish. Evolution on islands is not mystical. It is just concentrated. The same forces at work everywhere else become easier to see because the stage is smaller and the margins thinner. For humans, that smaller stage poses especially intriguing problems. Human beings are unusual animals because they buffer ecological pressure with technology, cooperation, memory, and flexible behavior. A difficult environment does not shape them only through anatomy. It shapes them through culture. Yet culture is not unlimited, especially in deep prehistory. A small, isolated population with modest tools, uncertain access to large game, periodic environmental stress, and almost no contact with outside groups cannot simply think its way out of every material constraint. Bodies still matter, energy budgets matter, childhood development matters. The cost of maintaining large brains and large bodies matters. An island like Flores does not erase humanity's adaptability, but it places strict terms on it. Over many generations, those terms may influence anatomy, as surely as they influence behavior. There is a revealing irony here. Isolation often feels romantic in hindsight, as though remoteness preserves purity or calm. In evolutionary terms, it is far harsher. Isolation means no rescue population when numbers crash, no easy exchange of genes, no steady arrival of new techniques, no casual migration when food fails in one valley or one season turns bad. Every local difficulty is more dangerous when escape routes are limited. A drought on a continent may encourage movement. A drought on an island can become a reckoning. A volcanic eruption can do more than alter the view. It can collapse a food web, choke water sources, bury habitat, and force surviving groups into tighter competition. In such a setting, anything that reduces energetic demand without destroying competence may carry long-term advantage. This is one of the reasons island dwarfism appears repeatedly in the animal record, and why it becomes such an important concept for understanding Flores. But before that conclusion takes shape, the island itself must be seen clearly. Flores is not an untouched wilderness outside history. It has long been part of wider regional patterns of movement, trade, and human settlement in more recent eras. Yet its deeper prehistoric identity is defined by the periods when those connections barely existed or did not exist at all. In that earlier world, the island's shorelines were thresholds, and its interior a series of constraints. The climate shifted with global cycles, but always through local filters. Monsoons' dry phases, changing vegetation, and periodic disturbances would have altered the possibility of life from one age to another. The creatures on the island were not living in paradise. They were living in a bounded system, one rich enough to sustain life and restricted enough to reshape it. That bounded system also explains why Flores matters beyond itself. It is not just the site of an unusual find. It is a test case for how human evolution responds when the usual assumptions are removed. If open plains, large interacting populations, and continuous connections across continents tell one kind of human story, then Flores tells another. It tells of confinement, of thresholds that are crossed once and then not crossed again for a very long time, of ecological simplicity that produces biological oddity, of a landscape where size, survival, and intelligence may be rebalanced under pressure rather than expanded towards some imagined universal ideal. What emerges is an island cut off not only by water but by expectation. On most maps, Flores appears as one bead in a long chain of islands. In prehistory, that visual neatness is deceptive. Each stretch of water between these islands has consequences. Each channel decides which species can arrive and which cannot. Each successful arrival begins a new and uncertain chapter. For countless generations, Flores remains its own world, in that sense never fully sealed, never fully open, always selective. And because it is selective, it becomes capable of creating outcomes that will be far less likely anywhere larger and less constrained. That is why the island matters before a single fossil is described. Long before Liang Bua becomes famous, long before a skull forces a revision of human possibility, Flores is already setting the stage. The geology raises it. The sea isolates it. Climate and topography subdivide it. Ecological limits discipline everything that survives there. By the time ancient humans appear in its story, the island is no blank backdrop waiting for actors. It is an active force narrowing options, preserving some lives, extinguishing others, and quietly preparing one of the most unsettling chapters in the human record. Once Flores is understood as an island of filters and constraints, its animals begin to look less like curiosities and more like a warning. The landscape is already telling the truth before any human bones are found. It tells it in altered proportions, in mismatched scales, in creatures that seem to have been adjusted by some stern local logic, until they no longer resemble their mainland relatives in quite the same way. This is one of the most important clues on the island, because long before scientists argue over what kind of human lived here, the fauna has already shown what isolation can do. Flores does not merely host life, it edits it. Among the most revealing examples are the proboscideans, the elephant relatives that once lived on the island in reduced form. These were not tiny in the sense of toys or fantasy, but they were unmistakably dwarfed compared with the massive continental animals from which such lineages ultimately descend. Their presence makes immediate ecological sense. Large-bodied herbivores need enormous amounts of food, wide ranges, and stable access to resources. An island with limited carrying capacity does not favour extravagance in size for very long. A smaller body requires less energy, reaches maturity on different terms, and may better fit the patchwork opportunities available in a restricted habitat. Over long spans, natural selection pushes toward thrift. What appears strange to human eyes is simply an animal answering the arithmetic of place. Yet the arithmetic is never only about shortage. That is part of what makes island evolution so fascinating. If limited food were the only pressure, every species would simply shrink. Instead, some become larger. On Flores, giant rats are among the details that linger in the mind because they feel almost designed to unsettle proportion. Rodents, ordinarily small and vulnerable on continents crowded with predators and competitors, can expand in size on islands where those pressures are reduced or rearranged. A larger body may help exploit new food sources, defend territory, survive leaner periods, or occupy ecological roles that on the mainland would already be filled by other animals. The result is a world where the familiar hierarchy of sizes no longer holds. The big becomes smaller, the small becomes bigger. The island redistributes scale according to utility, not expectation. That redistribution matters because humans entering such an ecosystem are not entering a normal world in miniature. They're entering a world already transformed by isolation. If the prey base is unusual, if available animals are smaller or differently distributed, if competition is reduced in some ways and intensified in others, then the entire structure of survival shifts with it. Hunting strategies change, energy budgets change, the seasonal value of certain habitats changes, the balance between risk and reward changes. Even before human anatomy is considered, Flora suggests that anyone living there must adapt to an environment whose rules are not borrowed intact from larger land masses. The presence of large reptiles in the region deepens that sense of a sharpened ecological edge. Komodo dragons are best known from nearby islands, and today carry a heavy share of the public imagination. When people think of this chain of islands, huge lizards patient and sudden, built not for spectacle, but for ambush, carrion, and brute persistence. Their existence is a reminder that island ecosystems are not necessarily softened by isolation. In some respects, they are harsher. A reduced number of large mammalian predators does not mean safety. It means different danger. A human moving through such a landscape would not be walking into a gentle refuge of reduced competition. There would still be threats at water sources, near carcasses, in dense cover, and along game trails. The evidence for the precise ecological relationships on Flores at different periods remains incomplete, and no single reconstruction captures every local variation over time. But what survives in the record suggests a difficult environment in which vulnerability and opportunity sat close together. That mixture of scarcity and danger likely shaped behavior as much as anatomy. A small island with unusual prey and serious predators rewards caution, memory, and flexibility. It also punishes waste. This may seem obvious, but it matters because island evolution is sometimes imagined as a purely biological process, as though bodies shrink or enlarge in response to pressure while behavior remains secondary. In reality, the two are entangled. A giant rat is not just a bigger rat. It occupies a different place in the food web. A dwarf proboscidean is not just a smaller elephant. It changes what size of prey is available, what hunting techniques are plausible, how many individuals can be supported in a given area, and how much meat or fat can be obtained from a successful kill. Every such change echoes through the lives of the creatures around it, including humans. There is also a subtler point in the fauna of Flores, one that helps explain why the island becomes such a powerful model for rethinking human evolution. The animals show that dramatic change can happen without drama in the popular sense. No magic is required. No catastrophe needs to transform everything overnight. Given enough time, enough isolation, and enough ecological constraint, extraordinary outcomes emerge from ordinary mechanisms. That is why the island's fauna matters scientifically. It creates a background against which human dwarfing or unusual anatomical persistence becomes more plausible. Not inevitable, not proven in advance, but plausible. If an elephant lineage can be reduced by island conditions, then the idea that a human lineage might also shift significantly under similar pressures no longer sounds like pure speculation. The island has already demonstrated its capacity. Still, the comparison must be handled carefully. Humans are not elephants, and analogies can mislead when they are pushed too far. Human bodies respond to ecology, but human populations also rely on tools, social structure, food processing, cooperation in child rearing, and transmission of knowledge. A reduction in body size among hominins would not simply mirror the path of another mammal. It would occur through a more complicated interplay of biology and behavior. Scholars still debate exactly how strongly island dwarfing can account for the proportions seen in the flora's hominins, and the evidence remains incomplete on some developmental details. Yet the broader lesson stands. The island had already built an ecological context in which dramatic size change was part of the local pattern, rather than an isolated anomaly. The more one looks at floras, the more the whole ecosystem seems to carry a kind of compressed intensity. Food webs are shorter, niches are fewer. Population sizes are likely smaller and more unstable. Climatic disturbance reverberates more quickly. A dry interval may thin vegetation and push herbivores into narrower ranges. A volcanic event may wipe out local habitats that would on a continent be replaced by neighbouring regions. Recovery can be slow, uneven, and contingent on who survives. In such settings, evolutionary experiments are not leisurely luxuries. They are constant negotiations with extinction. Some species narrow themselves into efficiency. Others vanish because there is no room to absorb repeated shocks. The island rewards fit, but only fit for that place and that period. When conditions change, success can become liability almost overnight. This also gives the island a certain eerie coherence. The dwarf proboscideans, the giant rats, the reptiles. The cave deposits the later human bones they do not belong to, separate stories merely sharing geography. They belong to one system of pressure. Flores is not a stage decorated with odd species. It is a machine for producing them. The expression is imprecise, but the effect is real. Its isolation screens arrivals. Its limited resources discipline bodies. Its fragmented interior localizes adaptation. Its instability interrupts continuity. The result is not chaos but repeated eccentricity patterns that seem bizarre only if the mainland is treated as the standard all life must follow. And there is something else the animal record quietly implies. Survival on Flores is not necessarily about becoming stronger in any grand sense. It is often about becoming cheaper. Smaller animals require less food. They can persist where larger ones fail. They can ride out bad years more effectively. They can reproduce under tighter constraints. On islands, efficiency is frequently a deeper advantage than dominance. That principle matters enormously when thinking ahead to the humans of Flores. Modern people often imagine evolution as a movement toward greater power, larger brains, larger bodies, broader command. Island ecosystems suggest another possibility. Under the right conditions, success may mean reduction, not expansion. Trimming, not accumulation. The body that wins is not the one that can do everything, but the one that can keep going when the margins narrow. This is why the fauna of Flores feels almost like prelude. It establishes the rhythm of the island long before the most famous discovery appears. The island shrinks what should be large. It enlarges what should be small. It preserves lineages in altered form. It arranges life into combinations that would seem improbable elsewhere. By the time humans enter the frame, the central idea is already present. Isolation does not merely preserve, it transforms. The cave fossils will one day make that lesson impossible to ignore, but the animals had been saying it all along. In that sense, the island's creatures serve as witnesses. The bones of dwarf proboscideans testify that even massive herbivores are not immune to constraint. The remains of giant rats testify that empty niches invite expansion where danger is limited. The predatory reptiles testify that island life can remain perilous even as some forms become reduced. Together they define the ecosystem not as a diminished copy of the mainland but as its own set of rules. Any human lineage that endures here must endure inside these rules, not outside them, so the evidence gathers before the human mystery fully arrives. Flores has already shown its method in the bodies of other animals. It has already demonstrated that size, form, and ecological role are negotiable under long isolation. It has already turned scale into a local invention. When archaeologists eventually uncover a small-bodied human in Liangbua, the discovery is shocking, because it concerns us, but it is not wholly without precedent in the island's deeper logic. Flores has been preparing for that revelation for a very long time, reshaping the lives that remain long enough to be remade. Long before the small humans of Flores acquire a name, before Liangbua becomes a site of argument and fascination, there is a more basic mystery hanging over the island. How does any hominin get there at all? That question sits at the threshold of the whole story, because Flores is not part of a landscape that wandering animals can simply drift into over generations by following valleys and plains. Water stands in the way. Not an inland lake, not a marshy obstacle, but sea, deep channels, real separation. At some point in the distant past, a population of ancient humans or human relatives crosses that barrier, and once that fact is accepted, the human story in island Southeast Asia becomes more complicated than older models ever allowed. For a long time, early human movement across this region was imagined in relatively simple terms. The oldest members of our broader lineage spread across connected land masses, gradually occupying new territories where climate and ecology permitted. Sea crossings of any significance were often treated as much later achievements, the work of fully modern humans with better planning, better tools, and perhaps more deliberate forms of water travel. But the evidence from Flores and neighbouring regions makes that older confidence difficult to maintain. Stone tools on Flores indicate hominin presence reaching far back in time, much earlier than the appearance of Homo sapiens in the region. This means one of two things, and perhaps some mixture of both. Either earlier hominins were more capable of crossing water than once assumed, or chance carried them across barriers more often than seems intuitively likely. Neither possibility sits comfortably inside the neatest version of prehistory. The most likely ancestors in this deeper phase are often connected directly or indirectly to Homo erectus, the highly successful hominin species that spreads widely across Asia after first emerging from Africa. Homo erectus is not a primitive caricature despite the way older popular history liked to portray it. It is enduring, adaptable, and capable of surviving across large ranges for immense spans of time. It uses stone tools, manages varied environments, and leaves behind a record substantial enough to show that the human story outside Africa begins much earlier than people once thought. Fossils from Java especially make clear that Homo erectus, or a close Asian counterpart, has already established itself in this broader island world long before Flores enters the modern imagination. From there, the possibility of further movement eastward becomes less absurd, though never easy. Yet less absurd is not the same as solved. Java during periods of lower sea level can be more closely tied into larger land masses. Flores cannot. To reach it, some crossing must occur. The distances might not require heroic voyages in the modern sense, but they do require surviving open water. That remains the uncomfortable fact. Scholars still debate how intentional those movements were. Some imagine simple rafts or other basic watercraft, not evidence of grand navigation, but of pragmatic crossing. Others allow more room for accidental dispersal, with storms, floods, vegetation mats, or coastal drift, carrying small groups beyond where they meant to go. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for all the timing and distribution involved. But whatever route is favoured, the result is extraordinary. A hominin lineage reaches an island it should have struggled to reach, and once there, it remains long enough to become part of the island's deeper evolutionary pattern. That arrival may not have been a triumphant expedition. It may have been desperate, accidental fragmentary, or repeated in small failed attempts before one founding group took hold. This matters because small beginnings can shape everything that follows. A population founded by very few individuals carries only a narrow slice of the original genetic range. It is vulnerable from the start. Disease, accident, infertility, poor seasons, or conflict with local predators could erase it entirely. If a founding population survives under such conditions, it does so on thin margins. Those margins become the first mould of future change. Isolation does not begin only after settlement. It begins with the tiny number of bodies that first arrive. It is also worth remembering how different the coastlines and ecological cues of the Pleistocene would have been. Lower sea levels expose more land alter currents near shore, reshape estuaries, and create opportunities that later disappear. A crossing that looks formidable on a modern map may once have been shorter, or at least differently staged. Even so, it would still have required hominins to deal with tides, currents, wind, and the basic terror of open water. This is one of the more humbling points in the story. The ancient humans who enter Flores may not have left advanced boat sails or obvious nautical equipment, but their presence alone is evidence of capability or persistence beyond what earlier stereotypes allowed. They were not passive walkers trapped by geography. Somehow, at least once they overcame it. Once the island is reached, the human story enters a new phase. Migration gives way to settlement, or at least repeated occupation. That change is more profound than it first appears. A journey across water, however it happened, might be rare. Life afterward is daily. Food must be found. Shelters must be chosen. Dangerous animals must be avoided or confronted. Stone must be selected and worked. Children must survive infancy in an unfamiliar ecological setting. Knowledge must accumulate. A crossing is a moment. Occupation is a system. This distinction matters because Flores does not preserve evidence of a single dramatic event, but of endurance. The tools and later fossils imply generations, not episodes. Ancient humans do not merely touch the island. They become answerable to it. Archaeological work at sites older than Liangbua, especially in the Soa Basin, has pushed this timeline back in ways that make the story even more intriguing. Stone artifacts found there suggest hominin presence on Flores hundreds of thousands of years before the famous cave remains. That is a crucial clue, because it means the later small-bodied humans did not emerge out of nowhere in the closing chapters of Prehistory. They have antecedents on the island, deep roots in time, and perhaps a very long local history of adaptation. The exact line from those earlier toolmakers to the later inhabitants of Liangbua is still debated, and the fossil record is incomplete enough to leave room for caution. But the overall implication is difficult to escape. Flores was not briefly visited. It was inhabited by hominins across a span long enough for profound evolutionary change to become plausible. This pushes the imagination into uncomfortable territory in the best possible way. Somewhere far back in the Pleistocene, small groups of archaic humans move through landscapes of grass, woodland, river margin, and volcanic debris. They cut stone, they butcher animals, they navigate a climate that swings between wetter and drier phases, and all of this unfolds on an island beyond a marine boundary. The older picture of human expansion as a purely continental process begins to break apart. It becomes clear that archaic humans were engaging with island worlds far earlier than many once believed. Not necessarily with elegance, not necessarily with reliable seafaring in the later sense, but with enough persistence that some crossings succeeded and some isolated populations endured. There is also a deeper consequence to this early arrival. The earlier a lineage reaches Flores, the more time exists for the island to work on it. Evolutionary change on a human timescale can seem abstract, because human generations are long and historical memory is short. But across hundreds of thousands of years, a founding population can be profoundly altered by selection, drift-repeated bottlenecks and ecological constraint. This is why the question of arrival matters so much. If hominins reach Flores early enough, then the later appearance of a highly unusual human form becomes easier to understand as the product of long local history, rather than sudden anomaly. The island is no longer a place where a strange species appears inexplicably. It is a place where an old lineage has been marinating in isolation for immense spans of time. Of course, caution remains necessary. No simple line runs neatly from early toolmaker to later dwarf human without gaps. The archaeological record is broken, not continuous. Sites preserve some moments and erase others. Different populations may have come and gone. Some artifacts may represent occupations separated by long absences. Scholars still debate how direct the connection is between the earliest known hominins on Flores and the later Liangbua remains. But uncertainty does not weaken the larger picture. It strengthens it because it reminds us that even the fragments already recovered are enough to show how much older and stranger this island history is than anyone once expected. And that is the unsettling beauty of the story at this stage. Before the body's reconstructed, before the skull is measured, before arguments erupt over species names and pathology, Flores has already forced a revision of human possibility. Ancient humans reached an island beyond easy land access. They did so early. They persisted there. The sea failed to keep them out, but once they were in it, helped keep them apart. That is the essential turning point beneath everything that follows. The island now stops being a remote edge of the map and becomes something more intimate and more severe, a place where human ancestry enters confinement. The journey out across water, whether deliberate or accidental, becomes the first narrowing. It separates a few from many. It strands one branch away from the broader traffic of continental life. From that moment onward, Flores is not merely a destination. It is a trap, a refuge, a laboratory, and eventually a mirror held up to the human family, showing that our past did not unfold along one broad road, but through crossings, isolations, and improbable survivals that left some of our strangest relatives waiting in caves. Once a small population is cut loose on an island like Flores, time begins to work on it in a different way. Not quickly, not dramatically from one generation to the next, but with the patient pressure of limits repeated over and over again. A bad dry season, a lean stretch in the prey population, a volcanic disturbance that reshapes a valley or poisons a water source, a founding group already small enough that every death matters, a landscape in which movement is possible, but escape is not. Over thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands, such conditions do more than test a lineage. They begin to narrow it. That narrowing is not simply a decline. It is a remaking under constraint, and on Flores it may explain how a human population starts to drift away from the proportions and expectations associated with its larger-bodied ancestors. The first force is almost brutally simple energy. Large bodies are expensive. Large brains are expensive. Childhood is expensive. Pregnancy and lactation are expensive. On a continent with broad ranges, varied prey, and large interacting populations, those costs can be spread across a more abundant and more flexible world. On an island, every calorie matters more. Food may still be available in abundance during good periods, but the risk of fluctuation is higher and the room for recovery smaller. A population that can survive on less mature on different terms and maintain itself under tighter energetic limits may gradually gain a decisive advantage. This is one reason scholars often look to island dwarfism when trying to understand Flores. The idea is not that evolution wants smallness. It is that in constrained settings, smaller size can become cheaper, safer, and more sustainable. Yet the process would not have been mechanical. Human beings are not deer or elephants stripped to ecological basics. They hunt, gather, process food, remember seasonal changes, teach children, improvise with stone and fire, and rely on social support. Those cultural capacities can buffer the environment, but they do not abolish it. A small island population may still face chronic tension between what it can obtain and what its bodies cost to maintain. If one generation benefits slightly from smaller average body size and that reduction does not undermine competence, then over long spans natural selection may favour those traits. What matters is not bigness or smallness in the abstract. What matters is fit. On Flores, fit may have meant a body scaled to the island's strict accounting. There is an older assumption buried inside many discussions of human evolution, and Flores quietly tears it apart. The assumption is that becoming more human means becoming more expansive, taller, broader ranging, more encephalized, more complex in visible ways. That idea flatters modern people because it makes the present look like a summit. But evolution has no summit, it has only responses. If a lineage finds itself in a bounded world, where a smaller body reduces energetic strain, lowers nutritional demand, and allows a population to persist through repeated bottlenecks, then reduction is not failure, it is adaptation. In this sense, the possible transformation of a Flores hominin lineage is not a reversal but a local solution. The island does not produce a lesser form. It produces a form tuned to circumstances most of us no longer live under. Genetic drift would likely have amplified that tuning. In large continental populations, gene flow tends to smooth extremes and preserve broader variation. On an island founded by a few individuals and only rarely replenished, chance can exert unusual power. Traits present in the founding group may become common simply because so little variation exists to dilute them. Repeated population crashes or bottlenecks can intensify this effect. A volcanic event, an epidemic, a long drought, or local ecological collapse might leave only a fraction of the population alive, and the surviving traits would then shape the next generation more strongly. Over immense spans of time, drift and selection need not oppose each other. They can work together, locking an isolated lineage into a path that would be far less likely in a larger, more connected world. This is where Flores begins to feel less like a location and more like a pressure chamber. Isolation reduces rescue from outside. Small population size magnifies chance. Ecological constraints reward thrift. Geological instability periodically resets the balance. Within that chamber, anatomy can begin to change in interconnected ways. A smaller body is not just a shorter body. Limbs, pelvis, developmental timing, locomotion, and life history can all be affected. If the later fossils from Liangbua indeed represent the endpoint of such Long Island adaptation, then what appears shocking in the cave is not a sudden oddity, but the cumulative result of an island slowly reshaping a human lineage across deep time. There is also the possibility that the change was not purely downward in size from a familiar Homo erectus-like ancestor. Some researchers have pointed to anatomical features in the flora's remains that look surprisingly archaic, as though the lineage preserved older traits, or followed a developmental path more complicated than simple dwarfing alone would predict. The wrists, shoulders, feet, and aspects of the skull have all fueled debate. Scholars still debate how much of the anatomy reflects insular reduction from a larger-bodied ancestor, and how much may preserve deeper evolutionary inheritance. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every feature. But even that uncertainty sharpens the story. It suggests Flores may not merely have miniaturized a known human type. It may have preserved a branch whose body plan already contained older elements, then pushed that branch further under island conditions. Whatever the exact starting point, the social consequences of small isolated populations must have been profound. A lineage narrowing in body size is also likely narrowing demographically. Fewer individuals means more pressure on cooperation, mate choice, childcare, and knowledge transfer. Every adult may matter disproportionately. Every child who survives may carry crucial information into the future. A foraging route, a seasonal pattern, a safe cave, a way to butcher prey, a place to avoid during certain weather, the behavior of reptiles near carrion, the stone source that flakes reliably. All of this must be transmitted within a smaller pool of minds than on a continent. Survival becomes intimate. Cultural memory may be rich, but it is held by fewer people, and therefore more vulnerable to sudden loss. And yet small does not mean simple. This is one of the most important corrections the island demands. Modern people often confuse scale with sophistication. A population with reduced stature, limited numbers, and a constrained environment may still possess acute environmental knowledge, flexible hunting strategies, and durable social intelligence. In fact, such traits become even more critical where the margin for error is thin. To survive generation after generation on floras would require attentiveness, not blunt instinct. It would require reading a landscape that changes with season and disturbance. It would require managing risk when dangerous animals, limited prey, and geological instability all shadow everyday life. The body may become smaller, but the demands of living do not. What begins to emerge then is a portrait of human evolution stripped of modern grandeur and shown in its harsher truth. A lineage does not adapt by becoming universally better. It adapts by becoming specifically adequate to a place. Flores may have favoured a population that was lighter to feed, durable under scarcity, and still behaviourally capable enough to exploit the island's opportunities. If so, then the distinctive body plan later seen in the cave fossils is less an aberration than an answer. A strange answer to modern eyes, but an answer written by the island's long arithmetic. The emotional difficulty of this idea should not be underestimated. There is something humbling, even unsettling, in accepting that one branch of humanity may have become smaller because that was what survival required. Not weaker, not failed, simply narrowed into sustainability. It confronts a modern instinct to equate more with better, and it suggests that human possibility includes forms shaped as much by subtraction as by accumulation. On Flores, abundance of imagination may have depended on economy of flesh. The two are not opposites. They may be partners. By now, the island's logic is tightening. A difficult crossing has already separated a founding population from its relatives elsewhere. The ecology has already shown a tendency to distort familiar proportions in other animals. The long-term pressures of isolation, scarcity, and bottleneck begin to explain how a human lineage could also shift. What remains is to bring that abstract process closer to lived reality, because bodies do not evolve in diagrams. They evolve in daily life, in hunted clearings, in caves after dark, in seasons of smoke and hunger, in routines repeated until they become inheritance. Somewhere in the deep Pleistocene on an island shaped by volcanoes and sea barriers, a human population is becoming more local with every generation. The bodies of children differ slightly from those of ancestors. Energy is spent carefully. Range is learned through memory rather than endless movement. The population remains small enough that chance is always dangerous and adaptation always unfinished. No one there would know they are diverging in the eyes of a distant future. They would only know the island, the food it yields, the dangers it conceals, and the forms of life that can persist within its bounds. That is how the narrowing begins, quietly, repeatedly, until the descendants of those long-isolated people become one of the most unexpected mirrors humanity has ever found. By the time a human lineage has spent long ages under the pressure of Flores, the island is no longer just a location in which life happens. It has become the measure of life itself. Every path through the grass, every cave mouth above a valley floor, every source of workable stone, every place where animals gather or water, remains late into the dry season, belongs to a mental map, built not on abstraction, but on necessity. Life in such a world is intimate with danger. It is intimate with shortage as well. The rhythms of the island do not allow carelessness for long, and so the daily existence of these small-bodied humans, whoever exactly their ancestors were, would have been shaped by a constant discipline of attention. Morning on prehistoric Flores is not silent. Insects rise in the warmth. Birds move between trees and scrub. Wind changes character depending on slope season and time of day. In wetter phases, parts of the landscape would feel dense and green with streams thicker cover and deeper shade. In drier intervals, open ground expands, grasses dominate some slopes, and movement across the land becomes more exposed. The climate shifts over long periods and shorter seasonal patterns matter too. A foraging group must know not only where food can be found, but when, and at what cost. The island is limited, yet it is not simple. It offers roots, fruits, small animals, reptiles, perhaps eggs, shellfish, or coastal foods where access is feasible, and the more dangerous prize of larger prey when opportunity aligns with skill. What survives in the record suggests tool use and meat consumption, but the precise balance of diet remains debated. That uncertainty is important. It reminds us that no single menu sustained these people forever. They lived by flexibility, not abundance. Stone tools, though modest in appearance, are among the clearest signs of that flexibility. Flores does not yield the dramatic visual grandeur of much later prehistoric technology. There are no polished monuments of craftsmanship here, no obvious spectacle. Instead, there are flakes, cores, cutting edges, repeated choices in raw material and method. To modern eyes, such tools can seem almost too simple to matter, but simplicity in archaeology is often deceptive. A sharp flake made quickly from local stone can butcher carcasses, cut plant fibers, shape wood, scrape hides, and solve dozens of practical problems in a day. For a small island population, reliability may matter more than elaboration. A tool tradition that works can be taught easily, and fits available stone is exactly the kind of tradition that endures. Intelligence in such settings is rarely theatrical. It is embedded in habits that prevent wasted effort. Fire too likely sits near the center of life, even if the traces that survive are often fragmentary and difficult to interpret with total certainty. Fire changes everything in a constrained world. It extends usable hours into darkness. It deters some predators. It makes food safer and easier to digest. It gathers a group into one place, concentrating warmth, attention, and memory. Around a fire, knowledge moves between generations without leaving a fossil. Roots are recalled. Warnings are repeated. The behavior of prey is discussed through action and demonstration, rather than speech preserved in any record. Injuries are tended as well as they can be. The day's risk is measured. On an island where small numbers make every individual more consequential, such nightly concentration matters deeply. Culture is not an ornament here. It is the invisible architecture of survival. The caves and shelters of Flores would have been crucial nodes in that architecture. Liangbua becomes famous much later because of what it preserves, but caves in general offer obvious advantages in unstable landscapes. They provide cover from rain and wind shade in heat security for sleeping, and a fixed point in terrain that otherwise changes by season and disturbance. Yet they are not automatically safe. A cave can trap smoke, concentrate parasites, attract predators, or flood. It must be understood and managed. The best shelters become known places, perhaps returned to repeatedly, perhaps used differently according to season game movement or social need. The evidence remains incomplete on how permanent or mobile occupation patterns were across different periods on Flores, but what survives suggests a life built from repeated familiarity rather than endless wandering. This is important. Island living rewards deep local knowledge over expansive roaming. Hunting on Flores would have required both patience and economy. A small-bodied human population cannot afford reckless injury. A broken limb, a deep bite, a fall on stone, or a serious infection could be devastating where group size is small and help limited. This means risk management must have shaped the pursuit of prey as much as hunger did. The presence of dwarf proboscideans in parts of the island's prehistory offers one of the most compelling examples. These animals, though reduced from mainland giants, would still have represented substantial food resources if successfully scavenged or hunted. But they would not have been easy. Whether humans targeted them directly, took vulnerable individuals, or exploited carcasses opportunistically remains debated in some contexts. No single scenario fully accounts for every assemblage. Still, the possibility of interaction between small-bodied humans and reduced proboscideans carries enormous weight. It suggests a predator or scavenger relationship operating in a world where the scale of both species has already been altered by insular life. Then there is the other side of the ledger: danger from predators and the island itself. Reptiles large enough to kill or maim are not theoretical concerns in this region. Steep terrain is a constant hazard. Floods, landslides, and volcanic disturbances can turn known ground treacherous with little warning. Even success carries danger. Carcasses attract competitors. Water sources concentrate both prey and threat. Dense vegetation can conceal as much as it provides. In such an environment, survival belongs not simply to the strongest individuals, but to the most attentive groups. Social coordination matters. Watching matters. Timing matters. A population living under these terms may not leave behind a visual evidence of its intelligence in forms modern people immediately celebrate. But intelligence is present in any lineage that endures such pressures for long. Children on Flores would have grown into this world by close observation. There is a temptation to imagine prehistoric learning as crude imitation, but on an island of narrow margins, learning would have to be exact. Which plants are edible in which season? Which stone fractures well? Which slopes are dangerous after rain? Which animals can be approached, and which signs mean leave immediately? Where water lingers longest? How to carry embers? how to move quietly, how to recognize the difference between a route that saves time and one that costs too much energy. In a small population, the education of children is not merely familial, it is demographic survival. Every failure to transmit skill makes the group weaker. Every successful transfer of knowledge helps hold the lineage together another generation. What is striking is how this daily life complicates any simplistic reading of the flora's hominins as somehow diminished. Small bodies do not imply a small world. In fact, the world they inhabit may be more densely known than that of many larger-ranging populations elsewhere. When territory is limited and resources are unstable, familiarity deepens. One valley side may be known for certain fruits, another for workable stone, another for danger at dusk. A coastline may offer seasonal opportunities but require exhausting travel from the interior. A cave may be worth the risk in 1 month and not in another. Such detailed ecological awareness rarely fossilizes, yet it is one of the most powerful forms of competence a population can possess. Scholars still debate the full cognitive implications of the flora's evidence, but the archaeological record itself makes one thing clear: these humans were not simply surviving by accident. Even their bodies, unusual as they appear to later science, would have been normal within their own world. Small stature may have lowered energy demands and aided endurance over rough terrain. Large feet so striking in skeletal reconstruction may have had implications for locomotion that are still discussed. Shoulder and wrist anatomy that seems archaic to modern observers would not have felt archaic to those living with it. It would have been simply the body through which the island was known. This is an important shift in perspective. The fossils tempt modern people to stare at difference. The lived reality would have centered on adequacy. Could the body climb, carry, butcher, avoid, endure, and reproduce under local conditions? If yes, it belonged. And so, daily life on Flores becomes the bridge between abstract evolutionary theory and human reality. This is where island dwarfing isolation and anatomy turn into lived experience, into smoke on stone ceilings, into cut marks on bone, into repeated journeys to water, into children learning safe routes by following adults through dry grass, into fear of sudden movement near a carcass, into the relief of shelter at night, into the constant unspectacular intelligence required to remain alive in a world that offers little excess and forgives very little error. By now the island has done more than shape bodies, it has shaped tempo. Everything feels compressed, distances, populations, margins of safety, the amount of food that can be wasted, the number of injuries a group can absorb. Life is local, cumulative, and exacting. It is not the grand march of humanity often imagined in textbooks and museums. It is something far more revealing. A human lineage cut off on a difficult island, learning over ages how to make a narrow world sufficient. When the bones eventually rise from Liangbua, that hidden sufficiency is what gives them their force. They do not represent a failed humanity. They represent a humanity adapted so specifically to one place that once removed from it they seem almost unbelievable. The first sign that something on Flores does not fit the familiar human story does not come as a grand revelation. It comes slowly through layers of earth that have to be read with patience. Liangbua Cave does not give up its meaning all at once. It offers fragments, contexts, associations, and then only after careful excavation, a body that seems to gather all the island's strange logic into one form. Archaeologists working in the cave are not looking for a revolution. They are tracing occupation, studying sediments, identifying tools, reconstructing environments. The process is methodical, almost quiet. But then the bones appear, and what seemed like routine fieldwork begins to shift into something far more unsettling. At first, the scale is what draws attention. The remains are clearly human in overall structure but smaller than expected. Not the size of a child, but close enough that the distinction requires careful anatomical reading. The proportions raise immediate questions. The skull is small, the limbs are short, the feet when considered in full are unexpectedly large relative to body size. Each feature on its own might be explained away. Together they resist easy dismissal. The body suggests adulthood, not immaturity. The bones carry the signatures of a life lived, not a developmental anomaly frozen early. Yet they do not match the proportions of modern humans, nor do they align comfortably with what most researchers expect from Homo erectus, the likely ancestral candidate for early Asian populations. The cave context matters as much as the bones themselves. Liang Bua is not a single event deposit. It contains layers that record repeated occupation and environmental change. Stone tools appear alongside faunal remains, including evidence of animals processed for food. There are signs of fire in some levels, though. Interpreting ancient burning is rarely straightforward. The sediments include ash from volcanic activity, linking the human story to the restless geology of the island. Dating techniques applied to different layers suggest that these small-bodied humans lived not in some distant, unreachable past, but in a period that overlaps with relatively recent phases of human prehistory. That timing is one of the most provocative elements of the discovery. It places this unusual population uncomfortably close to the era when modern humans are already expanding across parts of the world. What survives in the record suggests that the individuals found at Liang Bua are not isolated curiosities. The remains include multiple bones from at least one relatively complete individual and fragments from others. This is not a single malformed skeleton. It is a population. That realization changes the tone of the discovery immediately. A single abnormal body could be explained through disease, developmental disorder, or unusual growth conditions. A repeated pattern across multiple individuals demands a broader explanation. Scholars still debate the details, but the presence of more than one small-bodied individual strengthens the case that this is not pathology alone. The skull becomes one of the most intensely studied elements. Its size, significantly smaller than that of modern humans, raises immediate doubts in the minds of some researchers. Brain size has long been treated, sometimes too simplistically, as a proxy for cognitive capacity. A smaller cranial volume appears to challenge assumptions about tool use, social organization, and adaptability. Yet the association of these remains with stone tools complicates that picture. If the same population that leaves behind these small skulls is also making and using tools effectively enough to survive on Flores, then the relationship between brain size and behavior may not be as straightforward as once believed. The evidence does not resolve that tension. It sharpens it. The skeleton's other features deepen the puzzle. The wrist bones, for example, have been described by some researchers as retaining more archaic characteristics than expected, resembling earlier hominin forms rather than the more derived anatomy of modern humans. The shoulders and limbs carry their own mix of traits, some appearing primitive, others more aligned with later hominins. The feet, relatively large and with certain structural differences, suggest a pattern of locomotion that is still actively discussed. No single anatomical feature provides a complete answer. Instead, the body appears as a mosaic, a combination of traits that do not align neatly with any one known species in a simple way. This is the moment when Flores stops being a background and becomes the center of a scientific storm. The discovery forces researchers to confront a question that had seemed largely settled: how many kinds of humans existed in the recent past? The older narrative favored a relatively clean sequence. Earlier hominins give way to more advanced forms culminating in Homo sapiens, which then spreads, and replaces or absorbs what remains. Liangbua disrupts that sequence. It introduces a form that appears both ancient and recent, both small and capable, both isolated and persistent. The reaction is immediate and intense. Some researchers argue that the remains represent a new species, Homo floresiensis, a distinct branch of the human family shaped by long isolation. Others are more cautious, proposing that the bones may belong to modern humans affected by pathological conditions such as microcephaly or other growth disorders. The debate is not simply about naming. It is about what counts as human variation and what counts as a separate lineage. If the Liangbua remains are pathological modern humans, then the broader story remains largely intact. If they represent a distinct species, then the human family tree becomes more crowded and more complex than many had assumed, extending diversity into periods once thought dominated by a single kind of human. The evidence does not settle the question immediately. It requires years of analysis, comparison, and argument. Measurements are taken, bones are scanned, features are compared across fossil collections, statistical models are applied. Each new study adds clarity in some areas and new questions in others. There is also the matter of time. Dating the remains and the surrounding layers is crucial, and it proves difficult. Different techniques yield different ranges, and refining those ranges becomes a major focus of research. The more precise the dates become, the more striking the implications. If these small-bodied humans persist into a period overlapping with modern human expansion in the region, then Flores is not just an isolated evolutionary experiment. It is a place where multiple human lineages may have coexisted within relatively close geographic range, even if they never met directly. The evidence remains incomplete on whether there was interaction, and no clear proof shows direct contact. But the possibility alone reshapes how the human past is imagined. The cave itself begins to take on a new significance. It is no longer just a shelter or a site of occupation. It is an archive of a hidden branch of humanity. Each layer becomes a page. Each bone becomes a line of text written in anatomy rather than language. The work of excavation and interpretation becomes more urgent but also more cautious. Extraordinary claims require strong evidence, and the Flores discovery is nothing if not extraordinary. Scholars weigh each feature, carefully aware that the implications extend far beyond one island. What makes the discovery so powerful is not only the physical difference of the remains, but the way those differences resonate with everything already known about Flores. The small body, the unusual proportions, the mix of archaic and derived traits, all of these begin to look less like isolated oddities and more like the outcome of long-term island pressures. The fauna had already shown that the island reshapes life. The early arrival of hominins had already shown that isolation could be deep and prolonged. The daily constraints of island living had already suggested that energy and efficiency might favor reduction. Now in the bones from Liangbua, those threads come together in a form that forces the question, what if humans under the right conditions can be reshaped just as dramatically as any other species on an island? Still, caution persists. The evidence is strong but not complete. Some features remain open to interpretation. Some comparisons depend on limited fossil samples from other regions. Some aspects of development and variation are still not fully understood. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail of the Liangbua remains. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of the process. Science advances by testing competing ideas, refining methods, and accepting that some answers remain provisional. Yet even in that uncertainty, one thing becomes clear. The discovery at Liangbua is not a minor footnote in human history. It is a turning point. It reveals that the human story includes forms that do not fit neatly into established categories. It shows that isolation, constraint, and time can produce a lineage that challenges assumptions about size, intelligence, and survival. It forces a reconsideration of what it means to be human, not in a philosophical sense alone, but in a biological and historical one. In the dim light of the cave beneath layers of ash and earth, a population lived and died, leaving behind bones that would one day unsettle a global understanding of our past. The island had already shaped them. The cave had preserved them. Now the modern world is confronted with their existence, and the narrative of human evolution begins to bend in response. What unsettles scientists most after the Liangbua discovery is not merely that the bones are small, it is that they are small in a way that seems to break several expectations at once. For generations, the human story has been organized around a rough visual rule. Later humans are assumed to be taller, or at least more recognizably proportioned, more gracile in some places, more enlarged in others, and above all marked by a cranial size that appears to track the familiar narrative of increasing cognitive sophistication. The Liangbua remains disturbed that visual confidence immediately. They do not look like a comfortable step in a sequence, they look like an interruption. A human body compressed by unknown terms, retaining some anatomical hints of greater antiquity, while persisting far later than such a form was ever supposed to survive. The shock begins with classification. Scientists are trained to live with variation. Bones differ by sex, age, population, history, health, and individual development. One oddity proves little on its own, but the Flores remains present, a cluster of oddities that do not resolve into a familiar category. The adult stature is exceptionally short. The brain case is small enough to provoke immediate disbelief in some quarters. Certain postcranial traits appear unexpectedly primitive. The proportions of the feet and limbs complicate any assumption that this is simply a scaled-down modern human. If the body were found in isolation from all context, it would already be difficult. Found within a cave sequence associated with stone tools and a distinct island ecology, it becomes harder still. The bones do not merely ask to be described, they demand to be explained. That demand creates a deeper discomfort because the anatomy seems to challenge a habit of thought more than a single theory. Modern people often carry an implicit hierarchy of bodies. Bigger brains suggest more intelligence. More recent dates suggest more modern appearance. Small size suggests vulnerability, childhood, or abnormality. Flores scrambles all three instincts. Here is a body that appears adult but unusually small, a skull with limited cranial volume, and a context implying survival in a real and demanding environment. Even before the debate settles into technical detail, the emotional structure of the controversy is already visible. Many researchers can accept a strange species in principle. What they resist, at least initially, is the idea that such a species could survive so late-use tools and still carry anatomy that looks in some respects startlingly ancient. The history of paleoanthropology helps explain why this reaction is so intense. The field has long been shaped by partial finds and fragile frameworks. New fossils do not arrive politely, they disrupt. A jaw in one decade alters a migration model. A skull fragment in another forces the redrawing of relationships. Entire species have sometimes been proposed on limited material and later revised. Pathological specimens has been mistaken for evolutionary distinctiveness, while genuinely important diversity has sometimes been dismissed because it arrived in an inconvenient form. Against that background, skepticism is not unreasonable. Extraordinary specimens do require hard scrutiny, but Flores intensifies the stakes because the remains strike directly at assumptions the field had begun to stabilize around. By the early 21st century, many researchers were growing more comfortable with a branching human family, Yet even then, the late survival of such a peculiar form on an island in Indonesia seemed almost too disruptive to absorb at once. The small skull becomes the symbolic centre of that disruption. Cranial size has always held a disproportionate power in public and scientific imagination alike. Too much of human uniqueness has been tied to the brain for anyone to look calmly at a hominin with such a reduced cranial volume and still accept behavioural competence without resistance. Yet anatomy never speaks in one voice. A small brain case does not automatically mean an incapable organism, and scholars who study brain evolution know that internal organisation, body size relationships, and ecological demands all matter. Still, the visual impact is hard to escape. The Liangbua skull seems to belong to a much earlier chapter of hominin evolution than the surrounding dates would imply. That mismatch is one of the reasons the discovery feels so shocking. It is not just small. It appears out of time. The body beneath the skull only deepens the problem. The shoulders do not fit modern expectation neatly. The wrists have drawn attention for their more archaic-looking structure. The pelvis and lower limbs contribute their own puzzles, and the feet large relative to the body suggest a locomotor pattern still discussed in careful detail. The skeleton does not present a clean modern template miniaturized by one straightforward process. It presents a mosaic. Some traits appear consistent with long isolation and reduction. Others look as though older anatomical patterns have persisted. This mosaic quality is what makes the floras remain so difficult to absorb into any single familiar category. They are not merely strange because they are small. They are strange because they combine forms that modern observers do not expect to see together. That is why the first wave of interpretation is as much psychological as anatomical. Faced with a body that breaks expectations, many look for the most conservative explanation. Perhaps this is not a distinct lineage at all, but an unusual modern human. Perhaps disease accounts for the small skull. Perhaps developmental disorder explains the stature. Perhaps poor nutrition, genetic syndromes, or other pathological conditions compress the body enough to create an illusion of evolutionary difference. These reactions are not cynical. They are in part a defense against overreach. If pathology can explain the remains, then the broader human narrative remains largely intact. The bones return to the margins as tragic or unusual individuals rather than representatives of an unsettling population. But the cave does not make that easy. The anatomy is too patterned, the context too coherent, and the island ecology too suggestive. Even if one begins from skepticism, the remains keep pressing back. The proportions are not random. The traits are not all what one would expect from known modern human pathologies. The association with the broader island story of isolation, dwarf fauna, and early hominin arrival makes the idea of genuine evolutionary distinctiveness harder to dismiss. The evidence remains incomplete, and careful scientists continue to weigh each comparison, but the cumulative impression grows harder to escape. This body may not fit expectation because expectation itself has been too narrow. There is also something profoundly destabilizing in the dates. Had the Liangbua remains belonged to an age safely remote from all later human history, they might have been easier to absorb as one more peculiar side branch. But their relatively late survival means the bones do not sit at the beginning of humanity's story. They linger near its already crowded middle and late phases in a world where modern humans exist elsewhere, and other archaic lineages may still persist in parts of Eurasia. The human past begins to look less like succession and more like overlap. Not one kind of human replacing another in clean sequence, but several forms inhabiting the world at once, each carrying different bodies' histories and ecological solutions. Flores becomes especially disturbing in that frame because it implies that a highly distinctive human lineage could endure in isolation, while other humans anatomically closer to us are moving through nearby regions. This is also the point where the discovery begins to affect more than taxonomy. It alters the emotional landscape of human history. If the Flores hominins are real as a separate lineage, then the recent past contained a human variety far greater than most people were taught to imagine. There were not just minor differences of culture or geography. There were bodies shaped under such different conditions that if seen alive they might have seemed almost impossible to place. Yet they made tools, used landscapes, survived predators, raised children, and persisted on a difficult island. The line between familiar and unfamiliar inside the genus Homo becomes thinner and more unstable. Humanity stops looking singular even in the late Pleistocene. It becomes plural again. Scholars still debate aspects of anatomy, ancestry, and adaptation, and the debate is not a sign of weakness but of seriousness. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature. Some traits may be more informative than others. Some reconstructions are always vulnerable to revision as new fossils or better comparative methods appear. But even with those cautions in place, the basic shock never quite disappears. The Flores remains continue to force a confrontation with the limits of intuition. They show how quickly the human image can become unfamiliar once removed from the assumptions modern people carry about scale brain size and evolutionary direction, and that may be their deepest importance at this stage of the story. Before any final consensus is reached, before every competing diagnosis or species argument is weighed in full, Liangbua has already done something irreversible. It has shown that the human body can exist in forms that do not flatter our assumptions. It has revealed a lineage, or at the very least a population whose anatomy refuses to obey the simple logic of progress. The cave offers not a missing link, but a difficult presence, one that insists the human past was shaped not only by expansion and enlargement, but also by confinement, reduction, persistence, and forms of adaptation that seem almost implausible until the bones are in front of us. That is why the Flores discovery feels so unsettling long before the debate is resolved. It is not only evidence, it is correction. The island has taken the comfortable silhouette of humanity and altered it. What emerges from Liangbua is not a neat addition to the old story. It is a body that compels the story to change around it. Once the shock of Liangbua settles into sustained analysis, the argument becomes more precise and in some ways more difficult. The question is no longer simply whether the remains are strange. Almost everyone can see that they are. The question becomes what kind of strangeness they represent. Are these bones the traces of a distinct human species shaped by Long Island isolation? Or do they belong to modern humans affected by developmental or pathological conditions that mimic evolutionary difference? This is where the Flores story leaves the realm of discovery and enters the harsher discipline of comparison. Measurements matter, anatomy matters, population context matters, and because the answer has consequences for the whole structure of recent human evolution, every interpretation is tested with unusual intensity. The pathology argument emerges quickly because it offers a familiar kind of explanation for an unfamiliar body. If a modern human individual suffered from a condition that reduced brain size, altered stature, and distorted proportions, then the apparent challenge to accepted evolutionary frameworks would become far less disruptive. Several conditions are discussed in the years following the discovery with microcephaly, often receiving the most attention in public conversations. Other syndromes are also proposed, each attempting to map known developmental disorders onto the unusual anatomy of the Flores remains. This line of argument has a certain immediate appeal. Pathology is common enough in principle. Modern human skeletal variation is wider than many non-specialists realize, and the history of paleoanthropology includes cases where abnormal individuals complicated broader classification. Skepticism in that sense is not irrational. It is part of the field's immune system. Yet as researchers examine the Liangbua remains in greater detail, the pathology explanation begins to encounter growing resistance. One reason is pattern. A pathological body often shows a particular mix of deviations, but the flora's anatomy does not look like a simple modern human frame distorted by one known condition. The skull, wrist, shoulder, pelvis, limbs, and feet together create a suite of traits that many specialists judge difficult to reconcile with any single pathological diagnosis. Some features appear too archaic in form, not merely reduced or malformed. Others do not match the expected presentation of commonly proposed disorders. Scholars still debate individual comparisons, and the evidence remains incomplete in places, but the broader point becomes harder to ignore. The body seems coherent on its own terms. It looks less like a damaged version of something familiar and more like a stable anatomical pattern. Population context strengthens that impression. If Liangbua had yielded one isolated individual, pathology would remain a far more powerful explanation. But the cave produces evidence from multiple individuals sharing small size and unusual characteristics. That does not erase every doubt, but it changes the burden of explanation. One can propose a rare condition in one person. Proposing that an entire local population consistently displays similar features because of pathology is more difficult. It requires assumptions about unusually concentrated disorders, unusual population structure, or repeated coincidence that begin to strain plausibility. By contrast, an isolated lineage evolving distinct anatomy on a remote island fits more naturally with what is already known about Flores as an ecological and evolutionary setting. This is where island dwarfism enters the argument with full force. The concept is already well established in zoology. On islands with limited resources and constrained environments, large-bodied species often evolve smaller size over time. Flores itself supplies textbook examples in its dwarf proboscideans. The idea then is that an earlier hominin population, perhaps related to Homo erectus, reaches the island and over many generations becomes reduced in stature and body mass under local pressures. In broad terms, this is plausible. It matches the island's ecology, its isolation, and the pattern seen in other fauna. It also offers an elegant explanation for why a human lineage on Flores might end up so much smaller than its probable ancestors, but elegance is not the same as completeness. The more closely researchers study the flora's anatomy, the more they realize that dwarfing alone may not explain everything. A miniaturized Homo erectus might be expected to retain some anatomical traits in scaled-down form, yet certain parts of the Liangbua skeleton appear more archaic than a simple dwarf Homo erectus model would predict. The wrists in particular have often been central to this discussion, as have elements of the shoulder and lower limb. These features raise the possibility that the Flores hominins preserve older characteristics, either because their ancestry reaches further back than some early models assumed, or because developmental pathways under insular conditions produced unexpected retention of primitive traits. No single explanation fully accounts for all of this, which is why the debate remains so absorbing. Island dwarfism may be part of the story, perhaps a major part, but the anatomy suggests the lineage's history is more complicated than reduction alone. Some researchers have therefore entertained deeper ancestry scenarios, proposing that the Flores hominins may descend from a more primitive hominin than classic Asian Homo erectus, or from an early dispersal carrying traits that later populations elsewhere lose. These ideas are more speculative, largely because the fossil record in the relevant regions is sparse and broken. There are not enough intermediate forms to draw a clean line from an ancestral population to the Liangbua skeletons. That gap matters. Without a fuller record, certainty remains out of reach. Yet the attraction of these deeper ancestry models lies in how well they fit the mosaic quality of the Flores remains. If the lineage begins with a body plan already somewhat archaic, then prolonged isolation on Flores could preserve and exaggerate that distinctiveness, rather than merely shrinking a more familiar human form. The species argument in this light becomes increasingly persuasive to many researchers. Naming the Liangbua hominins Homo floresiensis is not just a matter of formality. It is a claim that the remains represent a distinct evolutionary lineage, one with its own history, anatomy, and adaptive trajectory. Species designations in paleoanthropology are never entirely free from controversy, because the fossil record rarely presents clean biological boundaries. But the accumulating anatomical evidence, the island context, and the weakness of many pathology explanations combine to support the view that Flores did indeed host a separate human species. Not every scholar agrees on every detail, and debate over ancestry and interpretation continues. But over time, the centre of gravity in the discussion shifts. The small-bodied humans of Liangbua are increasingly treated not as abnormal moderns, but as a real branch of the human family. What makes the controversy so revealing is that both sides are trying in different ways to protect scientific rigour. Those sceptical of a new species worry about over-interpreting limited fossils and repeating old mistakes. Those convinced by the species diagnosis worry about forcing anomalous evidence back into the frame of modern human variation, simply because the alternative is uncomfortable. In that sense, the debate is not just about bones, it is about how science handles disruption. When evidence collides with expectation, does one first assume error, disease, and exception, or does one allow the possibility that nature has produced something genuinely unexpected? Flores becomes a test of intellectual temperament as much as analytical skill. The island itself keeps pressing its case. Every argument about the bones unfolds against a background of ecological logic already established by Flores isolation, resource limitation, endemic fauna, deep water separation, and long-term hominin presence. This setting does not prove species-level distinction by itself, but it makes the existence of a locally evolved lineage far more plausible than it would be on a continent. The island had both the opportunity and the mechanism to generate something unusual. The fossils then provide the anatomical evidence that something unusual indeed emerged. There is also a broader lesson in the pathology versus species debate. Modern humans have a strong instinct to treat themselves as the default model of humanity. Any fossil that differs too sharply is first pulled toward abnormality before it is granted independent status. Flores exposes that bias. The body from Liangbua looks impossible, mainly because modern people have inherited too narrow an image of what a human can be. Once that image begins to widen, the bones become less absurd and more instructive. They no longer represent a bizarre exception to the human story. They represent a human story lived under different constraints on an island that took an ancestral population and reshaped it according to its own terms. Even now, the evidence remains incomplete. Ancient DNA has not been recovered from the Flores hominins, so one of the most powerful modern tools for clarifying ancestry remains unavailable. The tropical environment is harsh on genetic material, and that absence is a real limitation. Without DNA, anatomy and archaeology carry more of the burden, and both are open to revision as new finds appear. That means some uncertainty will likely persist. Scholars may continue to debate the exact ancestry of Homo floresiensis, the mechanisms of its size reduction, and the degree to which certain features reflect primitive inheritance versus insular transformation. But the central tension has already done its work. It has forced the field to think harder, measure more carefully, and accept a larger range of human possibility than many once found comfortable. By the end of this phase in the story, the issue is no longer whether Flores is strange. That is beyond dispute. The issue is what kind of explanation best honours the strangeness without smoothing it away. Pathology offers familiarity but struggles with the full pattern. Dwarfing offers ecological logic but may not tell the whole anatomical story. A distinct species shaped by isolation and carrying deeper evolutionary echoes offers the most compelling synthesis, though not a final closure. Flores once again resists simplicity. It asks not for one perfect answer, but for a willingness to let several lines of evidence converge without forcing them into a shape too tidy for the reality they describe. If the bones of Liangbua had belonged to a large-brained, broad-shouldered human form, the debate over species status would still have been important, but it would not have carried quite the same unsettling force. What gives the Flores discovery its peculiar intensity is the collision between anatomy and behaviour. The skull is small, the body is small. Yet the archaeological context suggests competence. Stone tools are present. Animal remains indicate access to meat and the practical realities of cutting, processing and surviving in a landscape that is anything but gentle. This is the point where the argument widens beyond classification and begins to challenge one of the most deeply rooted habits in thinking about human evolution: the tendency to treat brain size as a simple measure of cognitive worth. That habit is old, and it has always been a little too confident. Brain size does matter in evolutionary history, but not by itself, not as a clean ladder, and not in a way that allows behavior to be read directly from cranial volume. Even among living species, intelligence is not reducible to one number. Relative size, internal organization, neural density, developmental pattern, and ecological demand all shape what a brain can do. In humans, the symbolic weight of the brain has long overshadowed these subtleties. Modern people are used to thinking of large brains as the defining signature of humanity, and so a small-brained hominin using tools and surviving into the late Pleistocene feels almost like a contradiction in terms. Flores turns that contradiction into evidence. The tools associated with the Flores hominins are not elaborate in the way that later Upper Paleolithic technologies can appear elaborate. There are no carved figurines here, no cave paintings confidently tied to them, no spectacular blades or barbed bone points that modern viewers instantly read as signs of advanced thought. What there is instead are stone artifacts sufficient to do real work in a difficult environment. Cutting edges, flakes, repeated technological choices that indicate intention, knowledge of raw materials and transmission across generations. These tools may look plain, but plain is not the same as mindless. A simple implement made well and used effectively can sustain life just as surely as a more visually impressive one. The archaeological record often rewards modest competence less dramatically than innovation, but in evolutionary terms, competence is what counts. This is where Flores becomes especially important. The island does not provide evidence of abstract intelligence detached from environment. It provides evidence of practical intelligence under constraint. The inhabitants of Flores, whatever their exact ancestry, appear to have known how to exploit local resources, use stone for cutting tasks, move through a dangerous landscape, and survive over long spans. That kind of behavior requires memory learning planning at some scale and social transmission. It does not require modern-style symbolic complexity as far as the evidence shows, but neither does it fit any caricature of helpless primitiveness. The challenge is not that Homo floresiensis seems secretly modern. It is that they force a reconsideration of how much cognitive sophistication may be expressed in durable, low-visibility ways. The issue becomes even more interesting when hunting enters the picture. If these small-bodied humans were involved in exploiting dwarf proboscideans or other substantial prey, whether by direct hunting, coordinated scavenging, or opportunistic butchery, then the behavioral implications grow sharper. Larger prey animals are not just food packages waiting in a field. They require strategy, timing, cooperation, or at the very least the ability to process carcasses quickly and efficiently while managing danger from competitors. Scholars still debate the exact degree of hunting versus scavenging, and how directly particular faunal assemblages can be tied to specific human acts. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single scenario fully accounts for every site and level. But the overall picture is enough to pose a real problem for simplistic assumptions. However exactly they acquired meat, these humans were not passive island creatures stumbling through a landscape by instinct alone. Fire adds another layer to the puzzle. Controlled use of fire is one of those behaviors that has acquired almost mythical status in human evolution, sometimes treated as a threshold between the merely animal and the truly human. The reality is more complicated. Fire use emerges unevenly in the archaeological record, and preserving unquestionable traces is often difficult. At Flores there have been indications of burning. In some context, though, interpretation requires caution. Still, if the cave occupations did involve fire use in a meaningful way that would support a picture of nightly social concentration, food processing and environmental management not easily squared with dismissive accounts of the Flores hominins as cognitively marginal. Even without making fire the center of the argument, the broader behavioral record already points toward a population capable of sustained adaptation rather than mere persistence by luck. The real problem then is not whether small-brained humans could survive at all. Clearly they could. The deeper problem is why modern observers keep expecting intelligence to announce itself in forms that flatter modern intelligence. We tend to value what resembles us or leads directly toward us. Language leaves no bones. Ecological expertise leaves no skull engraving. Efficient teaching does not fossilize. Caution, coordination, timing, and practical memory rarely survive in the record except indirectly through the fact that a population endured. This means archaeologists are always working with partial proxies, and some of the most important capacities may be the least visible. Flores exposes this limitation with unusual force. It offers a lineage that seems in physical terms easy to underestimate, while the archaeological context quietly insists that underestimation would be a mistake. There is another subtle point here. A small brain in a small body is not necessarily the same problem energetically or functionally as a small brain in a large body. Scaling matters. The Flores hominins were not miniature modern humans with identical proportions in every respect, but neither were they simply large-body hominins with inexplicably shrunken skulls. Their whole anatomy belongs together. If body size is reduced under island pressures, then the relationship between body mass and brain volume may shift in ways that complicate any direct comparison with larger hominins. Scholars still debate exactly how to interpret that relationship in Homo floresiensis, and the evidence remains incomplete on the internal organization of the brain beyond what endocasts can suggest. But the basic caution is clear. Cranial size alone cannot carry the full weight of behavioral inference. Endocast studies which attempt to reconstruct aspects of brain shape from the interior of the skull have added still more nuance. Some researchers have argued that despite the small overall cranial volume, certain features may indicate organizational patterns compatible with more capable behavior than raw size alone would suggest. these arguments must be handled carefully because endocasts are limited and interpretation can become speculative. No single analysis can settle the issue, yet their importance lies in the way they undermine the simplest version of the old assumption. Even if the Flores hominins had very small brains by Homo standards, that does not automatically mean they were trapped in some cognitively primitive condition. Evolution can redistribute function, and ecological demands can favour efficient solutions over impressive-looking ones. The broader human record supports this caution. Intelligence in hominin evolution has never advanced in one straight line, nor has every adaptive success depended on maximal brain enlargement. Some lineages thrive through endurance, some through social flexibility, some through niche specialization, some through technological innovation. Homo sapiens eventually becomes extraordinary in cumulative culture, symbolic complexity and planetary spread. But that outcome should not be projected backward as the only valid template for cognitive success. The Flores hominins did not need to become us to become effective within their world. They needed enough perception, memory, cooperation, and technical competence to survive Flores. The evidence suggests they achieved exactly that. This is why the puzzle of brains and tools remains so valuable. It forces a kind of intellectual humility. A small-bodied human lineage on an isolated island carrying anatomy that seems archaic in some respects may nonetheless have solved the daily problems of life there with considerable success. The modern instinct is to ask how such a brain could possibly support such behaviour. A better question may be why we assumed it could not. The answer lies partly in the history of human exceptionalism, partly in the seduction of linear progress, and partly in the visibility bias of archaeology itself. We see bones more easily than minds. We measure skulls more easily than competence. Flores does not make brain size irrelevant. It makes oversimplification impossible. The small cranial volume of Homo floresiensis remains one of its most remarkable features, and no honest account should pretend otherwise. But when set beside tools, cave occupation, meat processing, and long-term survival on a demanding island, that small brain becomes not evidence of inadequacy, but evidence that the pathways to adaptive intelligence are broader than many once allowed. No single explanation fully accounts for every aspect of cognition in the Flores hominins, and scholars still debate the limits of what can be inferred. Yet the central lesson endures. Intelligence in prehistory is often quieter than people expect. It may live in sufficiency rather than spectacle, and that may be the most revealing thing about the island. Flores produces a human lineage that seems to violate a modern hierarchy, not because it lacks ability, but because its ability is expressed in forms that do not resemble the triumphalist version of ourselves. A small body, a small brain, effective tools, enduring adaptation. The puzzle is real, but perhaps the deeper mystery has always been our own habit of mistaking scale for capacity. On Flores, the record suggests otherwise. There, in a bounded world of stone prey, danger and memory, a different kind of human competence leaves its trace. By the time Flores enters the scientific imagination, the old image of human evolution is already under pressure from other discoveries. Neanderthals have long since stopped being seen as brutish failures. Denisovans, identified first through scraps and then through genetics, have revealed that major human lineages can leave astonishingly little fossil evidence, while still shaping the ancestry of living people. Earlier African finds have made it clear that the roots of Homo are richer and more branching than the textbook diagrams once implied. And yet Flores still lands with unusual force because it adds something the others do not quite add. It introduces a human population that seems shaped not merely by separation in a broad continental sense, but by prolonged confinement on a difficult island, where isolation becomes so complete that the body itself begins to look like a local invention. This is the moment when the story on Flores widens beyond the cave and the bones. The island no longer stands alone as a peculiar case. It becomes part of a much larger realization for most of prehistory. The world is not occupied by one humanity moving steadily toward the present. It is occupied by several human lineages at once, some widespread, some local, some physically imposing, some slight, some leaving abundant remains, some barely visible in the record at all. The human past begins to look less like succession and more like crowding. Not everyone meets, not every lineage overlaps in the same places, but across long stretches of time the planet is inhabited by multiple forms of human life, each adapted to different ecologies, each carrying its own inheritance of anatomy and behavior. Placed inside that crowd, the Flores hominins become even more remarkable. Neanderthals occupy large parts of Western Eurasia and leave behind a substantial fossil and archaeological record. Denisovans remain elusive in bone but unmistakable in genetic legacy and regional spread. Late Homo erectus endures in parts of Asia for longer than once expected. Early Homo sapiens expands outward from Africa and gradually reaches into territories already inhabited by other humans. In that already complicated world, Flores adds a lineage so geographically restricted and physically distinctive that it seems almost like a footnote until one grasps its implications. A small-bodied human population isolated on an island survives into a time when the wider world is already hosting other advanced hominin lineages. The human story is not broadening into simplicity, it is broadening into multiplicity. There is something almost geographic about this plurality. Neanderthals belong to cold zones, open plains, wooded valleys, caves, and the seasonal hardness of Ice Age Eurasia. Denisovans, as far as current evidence suggests, range across parts of Asia, in ways still being uncovered, their traces more visible in genes than in skeletons. Modern humans become the great connectors, the lineage that crosses deserts, coasts, river systems, and eventually oceans. Flores hominins belong to something narrower and more enclosed. They are tied to a single island system, to bounded resources, steep terrain, and deep water barriers. If Neanderthals represent one kind of human adaptation, and Denisovans another, then Homo floresiensis represents a particularly intimate one humanity, under insular pressure shaped by confinement rather than vastness. This matters because it breaks one of the most persistent illusions about evolution, which is that successful lineages inevitably become generalized and expansive. Sometimes they do. Homo sapiens is the obvious example. But other lineages succeed by becoming very specifically fitted to one set of conditions. A Neanderthal body is not a failed modern human body. It is a body deeply shaped by certain environments and ways of life. The same logic applies on Flores, though, in a more extreme and more geographically restricted form. The body there appears not as a crude precursor to anything later, but as an answer to the island's own questions. How much energy can be sustained? How much body can be fed? What form can persist when the sea keeps you in and resources keep you narrow? Seen in that light, the Flores hominins are not peripheral to the human story. They are one of its clearest demonstrations that human evolution is adaptive, local, and profoundly untidy. The possibility of overlap with Homo sapiens makes this even more arresting. Exact chronologies remain debated and refined, and no single reconstruction can map every movement in the region with confidence. The evidence remains incomplete, especially where tropical preservation is poor and coastlines have shifted dramatically since the Pleistocene. But it is increasingly clear that modern humans entering island Southeast Asia are moving through a world where other human lineages have only recently disappeared, or may still survive in pockets. This transforms the emotional texture of prehistory. It is no longer safe to imagine our ancestors stepping into empty landscapes. They are stepping into inhabited worlds, some occupied by humans who are more familiar to us, some by humans who would have seemed startlingly different if seen face to face. Whether Homo sapiens ever encountered Homo floresiensis directly remains unknown. There is no clear, decisive evidence of contact, no shared burial ground, no indisputable sign of exchange, no preserved conversation in tools or genes. Scholars still debate how much temporal overlap is likely, and how confident the dating allows us to be. But even without proof of direct interaction, the possibility matters. It forces the imagination to hold more than one humanity in the same regional frame. Somewhere across the wider island chains, our species is moving, improvising and expanding. On Flores, a smaller-bodied lineage may still be living under the older discipline of the island. They need not meet for the human story to change. Their coexistence in time is enough. This crowded world also changes how extinction is understood. Once there are multiple human lineages occupying different niches, disappearance stops looking like a single dramatic replacement and starts looking like a patchwork of endings. Some lineages vanish under climatic pressure. Some may be absorbed in part through interbreeding, as with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Some may be pushed out by ecological competition. Some may be reduced by demographic fragility long before any rival arrives. On Flores, the later question of disappearance cannot be answered properly, unless this broader human plurality is kept in view. The island population is not fading from an empty stage. It is fading within a world where other humans are already on the move, altering environments, prey, networks, and competitive landscapes, even if indirectly. There is another consequence to setting Flores alongside other hominins. It strips away the temptation to treat the discovery as an odd exception, and instead places it within a broader pattern of underestimated diversity. Time and again, paleoanthropology has had to relearn the same lesson. The human family was larger, more regionalized, and more experimentally varied than earlier models allowed. New finds do not usually simplify the picture, they deepen it. Neanderthals became more human the better they were understood. Denisovans became more consequential the less bone we had and the more genes we found. Flores follows the same direction but with a different emphasis. It reminds us that diversity in the human family is not just about broad geographic dispersal or genetic complexity. It is also about scale, body plan, and ecological specialization in ways that can seem almost unbelievable until evidence accumulates. This is why the word human begins to feel more elastic here, though not in a vague or sentimental way. It becomes elastic because the genus Homo itself contains more viable forms than once imagined. Large cold-adapted hunters in Ice Age Eurasia, elusive Denisovan populations spread through parts of Asia, modern humans with their extraordinary cultural amplification, and on Flores a small-bodied island lineage surviving with tools, memory and social life under intense local constraint. These are not deviations from a single proper template. They are the template humanity as a branching set of experiments, each one contingent, each one vulnerable, each one successful on its own terms, until conditions change. The island, in other words, no longer feels isolated from the rest of prehistory. It feels connected by contrast. Against the breadth of Homo sapiens, Flores offers confinement. Against the robust Cold World adaptation of Neanderthals, it offers energetic reduction. Against the genetic ghostliness of Denisovans, it offers a vivid anatomical challenge. Its distinctiveness becomes clearer when seen beside them. It is one more proof that the later Pleistocene is not the age of one dominant human form preparing for inevitable triumph. It is the age of overlap, coexistence, and local solutions. And that realization carries a quieter, almost unsettling implication. If several human lineages can exist at once, each one seeing the world through different bodies and inherited capacities, then our own sense of being the obvious endpoint begins to thin out. We are not simply what humanity was always trying to become. We are one surviving branch in a former thicket. The others were real. They occupied landscapes, solved problems, raised children, and watched seasons turn. Flores brings that fact close in a particularly intimate way because its hominins are not giant and imposing or genetically abstract. They are small, local bounded, and yet fully enough human to force recognition. So the cave on Flores now opens outward into a much bigger frame. The bones are still there, small and strange under careful light, but around them the whole human past has become crowded. Neanderthals in their valleys and caves, Denisovans in the largely invisible spaces of Asian prehistory, modern humans spreading, adapting, remembering, and on one island beyond a marine boundary a lineage reshaped by isolation still carrying its own answer to survival. The human story is no longer a single line crossing the globe. It is an archipelago of lives, some linked, some separated by water, climate, and time, all of them part of a past far more densely inhabited than memory once allowed. Every isolated lineage carries its ending inside the very conditions that once protected it. Flores is no exception. The same sea barriers that preserve a distinct human population also restrict its ability to recover from crisis. The same ecological narrowness that rewards adaptation also leaves little room when the system is disturbed. By the time the Flores hominins approach their disappearance from the record, the island is still what it has always been, beautiful, unstable, and unforgiving. Volcanoes remain active in the wider region. Climate continues to shift. Animal communities change. And somewhere within that tightening world, a small-bodied human lineage that survived for immense spans of time begins to vanish. One possible cause lies in the geology itself. Flores belongs to a volcanic arc, and volcanic landscapes do not merely create dramatic scenery. They repeatedly interrupt life. Ash can blanket vegetation, foul water, bury habitats, and destabilize already fragile food chains. A major eruption need not exterminate every living thing outright to become devastating. On an island where populations are small and fallback options limited, even a temporary collapse in local resources can trigger lasting damage. A prey population reduced below recovery, a key shelter zone rendered unusable, a sequence of bad seasons following an eruption, any of these might push a vulnerable lineage into demographic freefall. The archaeological record at Liangbua includes volcanic layers, and while no single eruption can be identified with total certainty as the one decisive event, the geological instability of Flores is not background noise. It is part of the pressure system surrounding every life on the island. Climate offers another line of explanation, though here too certainty remains difficult. The later Pleistocene is a time of repeated environmental fluctuation across the globe. Rainfall patterns shift, vegetation zones expand and contract, coastlines move with sea level changes. On Flores, those shifts would have been filtered through the island's already fragmented terrain. A change that seems moderate on a continental scale can have sharper local effects on a small island, especially if water availability, forage distribution, or prey mobility are altered. A lineage that has adapted tightly to one ecological balance may find itself exposed when that balance changes. Scholars still debate the exact timing and severity of local environmental changes relevant to the disappearance of Homo floresiensis and the evidence remains incomplete. But the principle is clear enough. On islands, resilience has limits, and those limits can be reached faster than they would be elsewhere. Then there is the question of animals. The flora's hominins do not live in abstraction. They depend on specific ecological relationships, and when those relationships shift, human survival shifts with them. If key prey species decline or disappear, the effect is immediate. Dwarf proboscideans, if they played an important role in local subsistence at certain times, would not have to vanish all at once to matter. A population decrease, habitat contraction, or altered distribution could still strain a small human group. Likewise, changes in predator pressure competition over carcasses, or the availability of smaller food sources might accumulate into chronic stress. Extinction rarely arrives with a label attached. It often emerges from repeated small defeats, each one survivable in isolation, lethal in combination. This is why the arrival of Homo sapiens in the broader region looms so heavily over the ending, even though direct evidence of contact remains elusive. Modern humans do not need to march into Liangbua Cave to matter. Their presence elsewhere in island Southeast Asia may already alter the wider landscape of competition movement and ecological use. If modern humans reach nearby islands and coasts, they bring with them flexible foraging strategies, broader social networks, and perhaps demographic advantages that a small isolated lineage cannot easily match. Scholars still debate how much overlap in time there was between Homo sapiens and Homo floresiensis, and no single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance of the latter. But it is difficult to ignore the broader pattern seen elsewhere in prehistory. When modern humans expand into regions occupied by other hominin lineages, those lineages tend not to persist indefinitely. Competition, however, need not mean open conflict. It can be indirect and still decisive. Modern humans may hunt the same prey, occupy the same shelters, alter fire regimes, or introduce pathogens for which isolated populations have little defense. Even the mere presence of a more numerous, more connected population can destabilize a smaller endemic lineage by changing the terms of survival. On continents, such pressures may play out over long frontiers. On an island, they can become acute very quickly. A small hominin population already living near demographic limits might not survive much disturbance before slipping below recoverable numbers. Disease is among the harder possibilities to evaluate, largely because it leaves so little visible trace in the archaeological record. Yet it belongs in the conversation precisely because isolated populations are often vulnerable to new pathogens. The evidence remains highly incomplete here, and any strong claim would go too far. No skeletal pattern from Flores allows a clear diagnosis of epidemic collapse. Still, as part of a broader model of fragility, disease cannot be dismissed. It represents one more way in which an isolated lineage may be vulnerable, not because it is poorly adapted to its own island, but because it is too specifically adapted to it. There is also the unforgiving mathematics of small populations. Even without catastrophe, even without competition, even without direct violence, very small groups can drift toward extinction through demographic instability alone. A run of poor births, several deaths in reproductive age adults, a local accident, a temporary food shortage, or the loss of social partners through ordinary chance can become irreversible if the total population is already low. This is one of the cruel truths of island life. Adaptation can keep a lineage alive for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet the final collapse may be triggered not by some spectacular event, but by numbers dropping beneath the threshold where recovery is possible. Extinction in such cases is not a dramatic ending imposed from outside, it is a quiet unravelling. That quiet possibility matters because it guards against over-dramatic storytelling. The Flores hominins do not need a grand apocalyptic ending to disappear. Their extinction may have been messy, local staggered and prolonged. One valley loses its group, another cave is abandoned. A final generation survives in shrinking numbers, still carrying routines and knowledge shaped across immense time, unaware that the lineage itself is closing. What survives in the record suggests disappearance, but not the emotional texture of that disappearance. There are no final scenes preserved for us, no last fire, no final hunt, no witness. The ending is inferred from absence, from the point at which the remains and tools no longer continue, and yet the surrounding conditions invite a hard conclusion. Homo floresiensis survives because Flores protects isolation. Homo floresiensis disappears because that same isolation leaves almost no margin when the island changes. Whether the final pressure comes mainly from volcanic instability, environmental shifts, ecological loss, demographic fragility, the arrival of Homo sapiens, or some combination of all of them, the logic is tragically consistent. A lineage so specialized to one bounded world becomes deeply vulnerable when that world is disturbed beyond a certain threshold. There is something almost unbearably human in that. Not human in the biological sense alone, but human in the pattern of survival and loss. Adaptation is never universal, it is always local. A body, a technology, a way of life may be exquisitely fitted to one set of conditions and helpless outside them. The Flores hominins embody that truth with unusual clarity. They survive where others might not have survived for far longer than anyone once expected. But their success is tied to a narrow ecological arrangement that cannot guarantee permanence. No lineage, however well adapted, is promised a future. By the time the cave falls silent of them, the island remains. Rain still moves across slopes. Volcanoes still threaten the horizon. Animals continue their own shifting histories. Modern humans eventually occupy the region, more fully carrying their own memories, languages, and stories. The small-bodied hominins leave no direct voice behind, only bones, tools, and a difficult absence. Scholars still debate the exact mechanism of their disappearance, because the record cannot deliver a final verdict. The evidence remains incomplete, and perhaps it always will. But the broader shape of the ending is visible enough. A distinctive human lineage confined and transformed by island life reaches the limit of what that isolation can sustain. That is the sadness built into Flores from the beginning. The island creates possibility by separation. It also creates vulnerability by the same means. What once preserved a different kind of humanity eventually helps erase it. The sea that kept others out also kept rescue away. The narrow ecology that shaped a workable body also narrowed the room for failure. In the end, Homo floresiensis does not simply vanish from a list. It disappears from a world that had remade it so completely that survival anywhere else may no longer have been possible. Long after the bones are buried and the last traces of a distinct human lineage fade from the island, Flores continues to hold another kind of evidence. Not in stone flakes or sediment layers this time, but in story. Mountains, caves, forest edges, and remote valleys often collect beings in local memory, hidden people. Dangerous little figures, inhabitants of places where ordinary settlement thins out, and the known world gives way to something older. On Flores, as on many islands with deep oral traditions, there are later accounts and folklore that some have linked to the possibility of lingering memory, the kind that survives not as history in the modern sense, but as narrative residue. It is an idea that exerts powerful fascination, because it seems to offer something almost impossible, the chance that a vanished human lineage might have left an echo in story after leaving so little in bone. The best-known versions of this fascination centre on tales of small, elusive beings sometimes described in local traditions. These stories vary in detail, context, and interpretation, as folklore always does. They belong to a living cultural world, not to a museum label, and that fact matters. It is tempting for outsiders to seize on them as clues waiting to be decoded, as though oral traditions exist mainly to confirm scientific discoveries. But that temptation should be resisted. Folklore is not a fossil bed. It does not preserve the past in a clean datable form. Stories absorb metaphor, warning memory humour, moral instruction, and the imaginative reshaping of real landscapes over generations. A tale about small forest people may preserve a deep cultural unease with remote terrain, a memory of strangers, a way of speaking about danger at the edge of settlement, or any number of meanings that do not require literal survival of an archaic human population. Even so, the resonance is difficult to ignore entirely. Once the world learns that Flores really did host a small-bodied human lineage, local stories about little hidden beings acquire a new and almost electric quality in the popular imagination. Suddenly, folklore that might once have been treated as ordinary island narrative becomes a possible whisper from prehistory. Could memories of encounters, however distorted by time, have survived? Could Homo sapiens communities on Flores or nearby islands have crossed paths with the last remnants of Homo floresiensis and passed those impressions into oral tradition? Scholars still debate how seriously such possibilities should be entertained, and the evidence remains incomplete in the strongest possible sense. There is no direct chain linking any specific tradition to the prehistoric hominins. No single explanation fully accounts for the similarities people sometimes point to. What exists is suggestive atmosphere, not proof. This distinction matters because Flores has already suffered from the seductive power of overinterpretation. A discovery as strange as Homo floresiensis invites exaggeration. Popular accounts often want one more layer of marvel, one more bridge between the ancient and the living. Folklore seems to offer exactly that. It promises continuity, mystery, and emotional closure all at once. But real history is usually harsher and less convenient. Oral traditions can preserve astonishingly deep memories in some cases, especially of landscapes, eruptions, floods, migrations, and dangerous places. Yet they do not do so in a straightforward archival manner. To treat a later tale as direct evidence of a vanished species would be to flatten both science and tradition, using each badly. The stories deserve better than that, and so does the archaeology. Still, it is worth pausing over why the connection feels so compelling. Part of it is scale. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and when a community has tales of small hidden beings, while an island's soil yields the bones of small hidden humans, the overlap is emotionally irresistible. Part of it is also the geography of islands themselves. Islands keep memory close to the land. A cave is not just a feature of geology, it is a place in a story. A ridge is a route and a warning. A forested hollow can carry reputations for generations. In such settings, the boundary between physical landscape and remembered landscape grows thin. Even if no tradition on Flores can be traced directly to Homo floresiensis, the island remains exactly the kind of place where absence does not stay empty for long. Human beings fill it with narrative. There is another reason caution is needed. Stories about hidden peoples are not unique to Flores. Variants appear around the world, often emerging wherever landscape becomes difficult, marginal, or symbolically charged. Small beings, forest dwellers, cave inhabitants, nocturnal presences, and in-between figures belong to a very broad human repertoire of imagination. They help communities mark the limits of safe space, the ambiguity of wilderness, and the existence of worlds adjacent to the everyday. That broader pattern does not make the Flores traditions unimportant. It simply means similarity alone proves very little. A scientific explanation requires more than suggestive overlap. It requires evidence that can be tested, contextualized, and distinguished from more ordinary processes of storytelling. And yet, for all the warnings, something remains undeniably moving in the possibility of memory outliving makers. Even if no tale can be securely tied to Homo floresiensis, the idea gestures toward a larger truth about disappearance. Extinct populations do not always vanish all at once from the worlds around them. Their places remain, their absences acquire meaning. Later, people inherit landscapes already shaped by prior lives, though they may not know those lives in any precise historical sense. A cave used by one species may become a place of caution for another. A valley once crossed daily may linger as a zone of unease. Human memory works not only through facts but through atmosphere. In that broader sense, it is not impossible that vanished beings leave impressions that survive without names. The oral traditions of Flores therefore occupy an unusual place in the story. They are not scientific confirmation, but neither are they mere decorative afterthoughts. They remind us that the island did not become meaningful only when archaeologists arrived. It was already thick with human interpretation, already alive with local knowledge, already layered with inherited ways of understanding difficult ground. Modern science entered that landscape late. The bones of Homo floresiensis emerged into a world where people had long been living with stories, roots, warnings, and names attached to the land. That should make us careful, not dismissive. The local traditions are not valuable only if they turn out to match the fossils. They are valuable because they reveal how human communities continue to make sense of an island that has been unsettling people for a very long time. There is also a lesson here about the hunger for continuity. Modern audiences often want vanished worlds to leave some living trace, some bridge that keeps extinction from feeling too absolute. A legend can seem kinder than silence. It allows the lost to linger. But the deeper power of Flores may lie precisely in the tension between trace and loss. We have bones, but not voices. We have tools, but not names. We have stories, but not stories we can securely assign to those vanished makers. The gaps remain, and in those gaps imagination thrives, sometimes responsibly, sometimes not. Scholars do well to resist forcing closure where the record does not provide it. If anything, the folklore of Flores expands the island's mystery rather than solving it. It reminds us that human beings always inherit more than material remains. They inherit atmospheres of place, inherited warnings, fragments of older worlds translated into new meanings. Whether or not any living tradition carries a distorted remembrance of Homo floresiensis, the island itself has clearly remained a place where hidden presences feel plausible. That is not scientific evidence, but it is culturally revealing. It tells us something about how certain landscapes continue to hold the possibility of other kinds of life just beyond sight, and perhaps that is fitting. Flores has never been an island that yields easy endings. Its fossils complicate the human family tree, its ecology distorts familiar scale, its chronology resists simple sequencing. Why would its afterlife in memory be any simpler? The small-bodied humans are gone as far as the evidence can tell. No cave today is likely sheltering a surviving remnant. Claims of recent survival belong to the realm of unsupported speculation, and they should be treated as such. But the thought of them persists half because the science is so strange, half because islands encourage this kind of nearness to the unknown. So the stories remain where they belong, not as proof, not as dismissal, but as part of the island's long human texture. They hover at the edge of the archaeological narrative without collapsing into it. They remind us that history is not only what can be excavated, it is also what later people feel in the landscape, what they pass on in altered form, what they sense as presence in places where the record is broken. On Flores, bones emerge from caves and stories move through villages, and neither can be reduced entirely to the other. Between them lies a silence that no single explanation can fully cross. But the silence itself is revealing. It is the sound of a vanished humanity leaving traces in more than one register, some measurable, some imagined, all of them shaped by an island that has never stopped holding on to secrets. By the time Flores is accepted as more than a local anomaly, the discovery has already begun to alter the wider map of human evolution. What first appears to be a strange island story gradually becomes a challenge to some of the strongest habits in the field. It changes how researchers think about migration, about body size, about cognition, and perhaps most of all about the degree of diversity the human family once contained. The old story had never been completely simple, but it was often told as though the path toward modern humanity followed a broad directional logic: larger brains, increasing behavioral sophistication, expansion into new environments, and eventual dominance by Homo sapiens. Flores does not destroy that outline entirely, but it makes it impossible to mistake the outline for the whole truth. The first change is conceptual. Before Liangbois, it was easier to imagine that late human evolution had already narrowed toward a smaller number of recognizable forms. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens could still be held in tension, and even Homo erectus, though longer lived than once assumed, often remained mentally assigned to an earlier phase of the story. Homo floresiensis complicates that chronology by persisting so late and looking so unlike the expected image of a recent human relative. Suddenly, late prehistory no longer appears as a stage on which only familiar figures remain. It looks more crowded, more regional, and more full of survival strategies that do not lead toward us. Flores forces the field to take seriously the idea that substantial anatomical difference can persist astonishingly late under the right ecological conditions. That matters because it reintroduces contingency into a narrative that too often drifted toward inevitability. The success of Homo sapiens now seems less like the obvious culmination of a single upward process, and more like the survival of one lineage among several. On one branch, humans in colder continental zones become robust and powerful in body. On another, elusive Asian populations leave almost no bones but a detectable genetic legacy. On Flores, an island-bound lineage seems to narrow itself into persistence, shrinking under pressure without losing its capacity to live effectively within its own world. No one branch explains all the others. No one form is the universal template. Evolution stops looking like a march and starts looking like a set of local answers to local problems. The second change lies in how migration is imagined. Flores demonstrates that archaic humans are engaging with island worlds far earlier and more flexibly than many older models allowed. Even if the crossings that first bring hominins to the island were rudimentary, accidental, or rare, they still happened. That fact pushes researchers to rethink the cognitive and practical boundaries once drawn around early human dispersal. Water is no longer a late monopoly of fully modern humans. It becomes instead a recurring threshold that different hominin populations may have crossed under different circumstances. Scholars still debate how intentional those early crossings were and how much planning they imply. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because coastlines from those periods now lie altered or submerged. But the broader lesson endures. Human movement in prehistory was more experimental, more opportunistic, and more geographically ambitious than the old continental model comfortably allowed. Flores also changes the debate around body size in a profound way. For a long time, body size in human evolution was often interpreted through progress-oriented assumptions. Larger body, larger brain, broader range, greater capability. But Homo floresiensis introduces a lineage in which reduction itself may be adaptive. This is not merely an oddity of stature. It is a direct challenge to the cultural instinct that bigger means more advanced. On Flores, smaller may mean cheaper to maintain, better suited to scarce island resources, and more sustainable over long periods of ecological instability. The island reminds science of something evolution always knew, but modern storytelling often ignored: there is no universal ideal body. There are only bodies that fit one environment better than another. That lesson extends into the question of intelligence. Few aspects of the discovery have had more enduring philosophical weight than the apparent mismatch between small brain size and successful adaptation. Homo floresiensis does not compel anyone to deny the importance of encephalization in the human story. What it does compel is caution. It shows that cognitive competence cannot be measured by cranial volume alone, especially when the archaeological evidence points to tool use survival across long spans and practical environmental mastery. Intelligence becomes harder to reduce to spectacle. It may live in sufficiency, in efficient social learning, in ecological memory, and doing enough with limited means. That is not merely a technical insight. It is a correction to the way modern societies often rank minds through crude, visible proxies. There is also a methodological consequence. Flores has made paleoanthropologists more attentive to mosaic evolution and less comfortable with expecting all traits to move together. A lineage may retain archaic wrists, unusual feet, reduced stature, and a late chronological position all at once. This means fossils can no longer be forced so easily into neat boxes built from single features. The human skeleton becomes less a checklist of modernity and more a record of uneven change. Some traits persist, others transform rapidly. Some are strongly shaped by ecology, others by ancestry, others by developmental constraint. The Flores remains precisely because they are so difficult to classify, cleanly have helped train the field to think in more plural and less linear terms. The discovery has also sharpened awareness of how poor the fossil record still is, especially in tropical and island environments. It is entirely possible that Homo floresiensis would never have been known if Liangbua had not preserved what it did, or if excavation had stopped at the wrong layer, or if a few crucial bones had decayed rather than survived. That thought has enormous consequences. If such a distinctive human lineage could remain unknown, until so recently, then how many other branches of humanity may still be missing from the record entirely? Not hidden in some fantastical sense, but simply lost to erosion, climate-inundated coastlines, and the normal brutality of preservation. Flores teaches not only that the past was stranger than expected, but that our picture of it remains dangerously incomplete. This incompleteness has made researchers look more carefully at island Southeast Asia as a whole. The region now appears less like a peripheral corridor, and more like one of the key laboratories of human diversity. Sea barriers, shifting climates, repeated dispersals, and patchy preservation combine to create a setting where evolutionary surprises are almost built into the geography. Flores does not stand alone anymore. It stands as a signal that island worlds may have hosted far more complex human histories than anyone once assumed. The human story in this region is no longer a side note to the grand narrative of Africa and Eurasia. It is one of the places where that grand narrative most urgently has to be revised. Perhaps the deepest change, though, is emotional rather than technical. Homo floresiensis makes humanity feel less singular and less secure in its own self-image. It is one thing to say in abstract terms that there were other humans. It is another to confront a body so small and strange, so apparently improbable, and realize it belonged to a successful lineage that endured for immense spans of time. The discovery weakens the instinct to define humanity around whatever qualities happen to distinguish modern people today. It suggests that the genus Homo once contained a broader spectrum of viable forms than our inherited imagination can comfortably hold. We're not simply the standard by which all others should be judged. We are the survivors of a much larger experiment. That is why florists change more than a few diagrams in scientific papers. It changed the atmosphere around the study of human origins. It made researchers more willing to expect surprises, more careful about dismissing anomalous finds, and more interested in how isolation and ecology shape evolutionary outcomes. It reminded the field that adaptation does not always produce what modern observers admire most. Sometimes it produces reduction. Sometimes it produces persistence without expansion. Sometimes it produces beings who look at first glance as if they should not exist at all, and once that lesson is learned, it reaches beyond Flores. Every cave, every island basin, every fragmentary site in the wider region begins to seem slightly more charged. The next unexpected lineage may already be waiting in some overlooked layer. The next challenge to human exceptionalism may emerge from a place once considered marginal. Flores has done that much. At least it has taken the edge of the map and turned it into a centre of explanation. The island no longer feels like an outlier. It feels like a warning against ever assuming the human story is finished, settled, or simple. What began as a few bones in a cave has therefore become something larger than a discovery. It has become a rearrangement of perspective. Human evolution is now harder to narrate as triumph, harder to simplify as progress, harder to draw as a tree with only a few major branches. Flores has shown that even late in prehistory, under narrow and difficult conditions, a distinct form of humanity could persist in ways no older model predicted. That realization does not make the past more chaotic. It makes it more real, more local, more contingent, more alive with alternatives that once existed beside us in time and now survive only in fragmentary record and the changed questions they leave behind. Even after the bones are measured, the debates mapped, and the island folded into the wider human story, Flores refuses to feel complete. That may be its most enduring quality. Some discoveries close questions by answering them. Flores opens questions by proving that older assumptions were too small. The island remains there in the Indonesian archipelago green, in places dry and others ridged with volcanic history, cut by valleys bordered by waters that once filtered life with ruthless precision. And somewhere within that terrain beyond what has already been excavated, the record almost certainly remains unfinished. Liang Bua is not the whole island. The known fossils are not the whole population. The tools recovered are not the whole behavioral range. Every conclusion reached so far stands under the shadow of a larger possibility that Flores still keeps more of its human story hidden. That sense of incompleteness begins with the fossil record itself. Paleoanthropology lives on fragments, and tropical island settings are especially stingy custodians of the past. Bone decays, water moves sediment, roots disturb layers, caves preserve some moments and destroy others. Open-air sites weather into near silence. Entire populations can exist for thousands of years and leave little more than scattered traces. This is why Flores matters so much as a lesson in humility. If such a startling lineage as Homo floresiensis could remain unknown until very recently, then absence elsewhere can no longer be treated so confidently as evidence that nothing unusual existed. The human past may still contain branches that have not yet been recognized simply because the Earth has hidden them too well. The island's geography encourages that possibility. Flores is not a single cave and not a uniform landscape. It contains multiple basins, river systems, uplands, sheltering formations, and zones that would have attracted occupation differently across changing climates. A population living there over immense spans of time would not leave all of itself in one place. Some groups may have favoured interior routes. Others may have moved seasonally toward coasts or lower valleys. Some occupations may have been brief, others repeated for generations. What survives in the record suggests continuity at certain points, but not completeness anywhere. Scholars still debate how representative Liangbua is of the Flores hominins as a whole, and the evidence remains incomplete in exactly the way one would expect on an island whose past has been repeatedly disturbed by geology, weather, and time. There is also the unresolved question of ancestry, and it continues to lend the island a feeling of unfinished business. If Homo floresiensis descends from a population related to Homo erectus, then somewhere between the earlier hominins known from the wider region and the later small-bodied cave inhabitants there should once have existed intermediate forms, whether on Flores itself or on nearby islands now altered beyond recognition. If, on the other hand, the lineage reaches back to a more archaic ancestor than many initially assumed, then the implications become even more dramatic, and the missing evidence even more tantalizing. At present, no single explanation fully accounts for every anatomical feature and every chronological challenge. That is not failure, it is a map of where discovery has not yet reached. The difficulty of recovering ancient DNA intensifies this uncertainty. In cooler parts of the world, genetic evidence has transformed human origins research, revealing relationships that bones alone could only hint at. On Flores, the tropical environment is far harsher to such preservation. Heat, humidity, and time conspire against molecular survival. That means the island keeps one of its most direct answers largely out of reach. Without DNA, the bones must carry more interpretive weight, and bones, however eloquent, cannot always settle ancestry with the precision genetics sometimes can. This limitation deepens the mystery. Flores is understood enough to be undeniable, yet not enough to be fully resolved. And then there is the broader surrounding region still dotted with islands that once stood as thresholds, traps, refuges, and stepping stones. Flores teaches that isolation in island Southeast Asia can produce extraordinary human outcomes. Once that is accepted, it becomes harder to look at nearby islands as blank spaces. Each has its own geological history, its own ecological constraints, its own vanished shorelines, its own possibilities for forgotten populations. Some may yield nothing. Some may one day yield traces that seem minor until viewed through the lens Flores has provided. The lesson is no longer that one island was strangely unique in a way that can be safely contained. The lesson is that the region as a whole may have hosted a more varied and experimental human past than the surviving evidence presently shows. This is why Flores continues to work on the imagination even after the major scientific arguments are laid out. It offers no easy closure. Instead, it leaves behind a disciplined kind of unease. The human family was broader than expected. Human adaptation could take forms far less familiar than the modern body would suggest. Island life could reshape a lineage so completely that later people might struggle to recognize it as kin at first glance. And the records supporting all of this emerge from one cave on one island, in a region where preservation is partial and discovery remains uneven. The obvious implication is that the story is not finished. In that sense, Flores becomes more than a site. It becomes a way of looking at the past, a warning against assuming that the known record is proportionate to the life that once existed. A reminder that evolution does not move toward our preferred image of humanity. A demonstration that small populations in bounded worlds can produce outcomes as revealing as any continental saga. The island still stands behind all those lessons quiet and difficult, keeping most of its chronology buried in sediment, ash and stone, and so the story returns at last to landscape, to cave mouths darkening in the evening, to ridges holding dry grass under seasonal wind, to the long volcanic memory under the soil, to the sea itself, the old gatekeeper separating Flores from easier narratives. Somewhere in that terrain, ancient people once moved in bodies adapted to an island that both preserved and constrained them. They made tools, found food, taught the young, survived dangers, and endured for spans of time that modern certainty did not expect. Then they disappeared, leaving just enough behind to force the rest of humanity to reconsider what it had been. Flores still keeps secrets because islands like this always do. They narrow evidence even as they intensify meaning. A cave can hold one astonishing truth while 10 others remain outside the excavated square. A single bone can revise a species' history while leaving ancestry unresolved. A landscape can feel fully known in the present and still contain a vanished population just below the level of memory. That is the final effect of the island. It does not merely add one more chapter to human evolution. It makes the unwritten chapters feel suddenly closer. If there is a lasting image here, it is not only the small skull under laboratory light, or the careful brush moving across ancient sediment. It is the island itself suspended between land and sea, between evidence and absence, between what has been found and what almost certainly has not. In that tension lies the real legacy of Flores. It tells us that humanity was once wider in form, narrower in place, and stranger in survival than the surviving record comfortably admits. And it leaves us with the unsettling possibility that even now in caves not yet excavated, and deposits not yet recognized, pieces of that missing human world are still waiting. The rain eases over Flores the way time often eases over old places, not by ending, but by thinning into mist. The island remains after the arguments, after the measurements, after the names assigned in journals and the careful reconstructions in museums. Its slopes still rise under cloud, its caves still open in shadow, its soil still holds ash from eruptions and the dust of vanished seasons. And somewhere beneath those layers is the memory of a human life lived to a different scale. That may be the quietest and most lasting truth of the island. Not that it produced a mystery, though it did. Not that it changed science, though it certainly did that too. But that it preserved for a brief moment in the modern world the fact that humanity was never only one shape, one destiny, one body moving toward one inevitable future. On Flores, survival took another form. Smaller, more local, more vulnerable, and for a very long time sufficient. The people who lived there did not know they would one day be called strange. They did not know that their bones would unsettle a distant species that was also their kin. They only knew the island's demands, the paths to water, the danger at the edge of cover, the feel of stone that breaks cleanly, the rhythm of hunger and shelter and weather, the children who had to learn quickly, the nights gathered around warmth, the seasons when the land gave enough and the harder seasons when it did not. Then they passed as all human lineages pass eventually, whether into extinction or memory or both. The island kept them longer than most places could have. It buried them under sediment and silence. It let the sea go on guarding its margins. It allowed forests to grow, recede, and return. And much later, when the cave was opened again by other hands, their existence rose not as a legend fulfilled, but as something more powerful and more difficult evidence that the world had once held another kind of human living beside the great unfinished complexity of prehistory. Perhaps that is why Flores lingers in the mind. It makes the human story feel less secure but also more alive, more crowded, more fragile, more shaped by accident, geography, and the stubborn local terms of survival. It reminds us that entire ways of being human can disappear so completely that only a few bones remain, and yet those bones can still widen the world. So the final image is a simple one, an island at dusk, dark cave mouth, wet leaves holding the last light, beyond them the sea. Somewhere in that gathering dimness long ago, small figures move through grass and stone, fully at home in a world that no longer exists. Then even they are gone, and only the island remains listening to rain, keeping its secrets a little longer.